Welcome. Tonight, we travel back far beyond memory to a time before empires, before pyramids, before the histories we know were even written. We go to the land between two rivers, to a place where cities first rose from the earth, where humanity made its first great leap into civilization. This is the story of Sumer, the first civilization, a world of sacred rivers, star-watching priests, clay tablets, and whispered prayers. Together, we'll explore the lives they lived, the gods they honored, the knowledge they shaped from mud and starlight. No need to stay awake. Let your thoughts drift with the current of time as we begin the long, beautiful story of the Sumerians. Long before the pyramids rose along the Nile, before the walls of Babylon shimmered under the desert sun, and long before the stories of the Greeks and Romans echoed across time, there was Sumer, a land cradled between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a region we now call Mesopotamia. It is here, in the Fertile Crescent, that something remarkable began. A spark, a whisper of civilization that would become the very first known to humankind. The Sumerians, their name almost mythical, were the first to take the scattered sparks of human ingenuity and shape them into something enduring. They built cities, not just villages or tribes, but cities with walls and temples, with priests and scribes, with markets full of life. They spoke a language like no other, a language isolate, and they wrote using tiny wedge-shaped impressions in clay, known as cuneiform. They were the first to write history, and in doing so, they became a part of it. But who were they, and where did they come from? Their own texts do not tell us. They spoke of a time when gods ruled over men, of a past so ancient that even they considered it mythical. According to the Sumerians, they did not invent their civilization. It was gifted to them, delivered from the heavens by beings called the Inanna, who descended to the earth and established order in what was once chaos. The Sumerians were not just inventors, they were inheritors. They settled in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now modern-day Iraq, sometime before 4000 BCE. But their true rise began a bit later, around 3100 BCE, in a world that was rapidly changing. The climate had stabilized after the Younger Dryas, allowing the development of agriculture. With reliable food came surpluses, and with surpluses came complexity. The people needed new ways to organize, to store knowledge, to communicate, and the Sumerians rose to meet that need. They built city-states, each one ruled by a local king or high priest. Cities like Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur. Each city had its own patron deity, its own temple, its own myths. And yet, these cities were connected by trade, by language, and by a shared cosmology. Their temples were not merely places of worship. They were ziggurats, massive terrace structures that reached for the heavens. The Sumerians believed these were the homes of the gods on earth, and they were built to reflect the cosmic order. One of the most important cities was Eridu, considered by the Sumerians to be the very first city founded by the gods themselves. It was the seat of Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. In their texts, it is said that kingship descended from heaven, and Eridu was its first destination. From there, civilization spread like a ripple through water, reaching Uruk, where one of the greatest of all kings would one day rise, Gilgamesh. But before kings, before epics and legends, there were simple people with extraordinary dreams. The Sumerians mastered irrigation, channeling the rivers to feed their fields. They invented the wheel, not just for transport, but for pottery, revolutionizing how goods were made and stored. They created a calendar based on lunar cycles, developed complex mathematics, and understood the movements of stars with a precision that still confounds modern scholars. Their world was not primitive. It was intricate, layered with ritual and order. They believed the universe was a dome, with the earth beneath, and the heavens above, and the netherworld below. Every act had meaning. Every grain harvested. Every prayer whispered. Every star tracked across the night sky. Life was not random. It was guided by divine forces, a balance between chaos and order that had to be maintained. Through ritual, sacrifice, and knowledge, the Sumerians sought harmony with the divine. And yet, so much about them remains a mystery. We dig through their ruins, decipher their tablets, and still we are left with questions. Why did they vanish? Why did they never speak of their origin clearly? Why did they claim that their knowledge came from beings not of this world? Were these simply myths or echoes of something older, something deeper? Their legacy survives in the very foundation of our own civilization. Writing, law, astronomy, literature, the echoes of Sumer still resonate through time. As we journey deeper into their story, we will uncover the lives of their kings, the secrets of their temples, the myths that guided their every step, and the hidden knowledge they left behind, waiting, whispering, beneath layers of sand and time. Among all the cities of Sumer, none held more power, more mystique than Uruk. This city, nestled near the banks of the Euphrates, became the epicenter of early civilization. Its name echoed in the ancient tongue as Unug, and in time it would inspire the very name of the region, Iraq. Uruk was immense for its time, spreading across many hectares, protected by massive walls and dominated by two great temple districts. Within those temples, the fate of humanity was said to be recorded and guided. Uruk was the city of Inanna, goddess of love, war, fertility, and transformation. Her temple, the Inanna, was not only a spiritual center but also a bureaucratic one. Here, the earliest evidence of writing was discovered, not on paper or stone, but on clay tablets, etched with a stylus in careful lines and impressions. These early scripts did not tell stories at first. They counted grain, recorded transactions, and managed temples. But over time, symbols became words, and words became memory. Writing, that powerful invention, was born out of necessity. As Uruk grew, its economy became complex. Trade routes stretched out like veins, connecting Sumer to the north, east, and west. Goods poured in, copper from the mountains, timber from distant forests, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. The priests needed records, and so they created a visual language. Cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped, emerged as a means to hold knowledge in permanence. From these earliest marks, history began. The people of Uruk were not merely scribes and traders. They were also architects of myth. It was in Uruk that the epic of Gilgamesh was born. Though written down centuries later, its roots are deep in this city. Gilgamesh, the legendary king, was said to have ruled Uruk for 126 years, half god, half man. He built the city's walls, sought immortality, and defied the gods. His tale, rich in symbolism, speaks of the tension between civilization and the wild, between the divine and the mortal, between knowing and unknowing. The epic is more than a story. It is a mirror into the soul of the Sumerians. Through Gilgamesh's journey, we see their fears, their hopes, their reverence for the gods, and their deep understanding of life's impermanence. Even in seeking eternal life, Gilgamesh learns the truth that wisdom lies not in conquering death, but in embracing the fragile beauty of being. In the temples of Uruk, priests observed the heavens. They tracked the stars and planets, not as astronomers, but as those seeking omens and signs. The Sumerians believed the gods communicated through celestial movements. Each star was a divine scribe, each eclipse a warning, each phase of the moon a whisper from the beyond. Their understanding of time was both spiritual and practical. They divided the day into units, developed sexagesimal, base 60, mathematics, and laid the groundwork for the hour, the minute, and the second. As Uruk flourished, it became a beacon. Its culture, language, and technology spread to neighboring lands. This era is often referred to as the Uruk expansion. It was not an empire by conquest, but an influence that rippled across the land. Sumerian pottery, weights, and tablets appear in faraway regions. It was as if the very idea of civilization radiated from Uruk, carried by caravans, by travelers, by dreamers. Yet for all its brilliance, Uruk was also a place of hierarchy. The temples controlled land and labor. Slavery existed. The priests held immense power, not just spiritually, but economically. There was structure, order, but also inequality. And within this structure, the Sumerians sought to appease the gods through rituals, offerings, and strict adherence to divine law. They believed that each city was a reflection of the heavens, that the gods had assigned each one a destiny. When the people obeyed, prosperity followed. When they strayed, disaster came. Droughts, floods, invasions, all were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. It was a fragile balance, civilization resting on the favor of unseen forces. Even the construction of temples followed sacred geometry. Each brick was laid with intention, each level of the ziggurat representing a layer of the cosmos. The higher one climbed, the closer one came to the divine. But only the priests could ascend to the summit. Only they could commune with the gods. For the ordinary people, faith was lived in rituals and festivals, in honoring the spirits of ancestors, and in the stories passed down generation after generation. As we move forward in the Sumerian saga, we will explore the rise of kingship, the laws that govern this ancient land, and the remarkable women who held power in a world often ruled by men. The story of Sumer is not just the story of a civilization. It is the dawn of humanity's quest for meaning, for order, for eternity. In the beginning, according to the Sumerians, there was no human king. Only the gods ruled the cities. Kingship was considered a divine institution, not created by man, but bestowed from the heavens. Their ancient texts tell us, in solemn phrases, that kingship descended from heaven, and once it did, the world was forever changed. Rulership, law, and civilization became inextricably tied to the will of the gods, and kings were seen not just as leaders, but as chosen vessels of divine authority. The earliest kings were often priest kings, intermediaries between the gods and the people. They performed rituals, consulted omens, and maintained the temple estates. Their power was rooted in their connection to the divine, and the belief that order must be preserved at all costs. In Sumer, this divine order was called Me, a sacred set of rules and attributes governing everything from kingship and wisdom to weaving and lovemaking. The Me were said to have been stored by the gods and later gifted to humanity. One of the oldest known kings was Alulim of Eridu, named in the Sumerian king list, a semi-mythical record that blends history and legend. Alulim, according to the text, ruled for tens of thousands of years. This impossibly long reign was not meant to be literal, but symbolic, showing that in ancient memory, kingship once held cosmic weight. Time moved differently in those mythic ages. And the deeper we go into Sumerian myth, the more the boundary between fact and fable dissolves. The king list itself is a fascinating artifact, part historical record, part theological document. It lists the names of rulers, their cities, and the lengths of their reigns, from the mythical to the plausible. What's intriguing is the way it frames power. Kingship does not originate in one place and remain there. It moves, transferred by the gods from one city to another. This concept reflects not only the religious worldview of the Sumerians, but the political reality of shifting dominance across city-states. Each city-state in Sumer was independent, yet connected. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, each with its own temple, its own patron deity, and its own ruler. At times, one city would rise above the others, claiming dominance, but such supremacy was always temporary. Peace was rare, wars were frequent, but they were fought with an underlying belief that order must eventually return. Even in conquest, the gods' will had to be acknowledged. The kings of Sumer bore titles such as Lugal, great man, and Ensi, governor or high priest, titles that implied both earthly power and divine responsibility. Some kings, like Lugal-Zagessi, attempted to unite Sumer under a single rule, with varying degrees of success. But kingship was not just about war and politics. It was also about building, preserving, and creating legacies. Great kings commissioned temples, canals, walls, and statues, not just for glory, but to maintain harmony with the cosmos. One such ruler was Enheduanna of Lagash, who left behind clay cones describing his efforts to restore justice and property rights. He, like others, understood that the legitimacy of a king was measured not just by power, but by righteousness, by how well he upheld Kuduru, the sacred boundary, between right and wrong, between chaos and order. The Sumerians believed that kings who strayed from this path would bring ruin upon their people. Women, too, played vital roles in this sacred order. Priestesses held high office, performed essential rituals, and managed temple lands. The most famous among them was Enheduanna, daughter of the mighty king Sargon of Akkad. She was high priestess of the moon god Inanna in the city of and more than that, she was a poet. Her hymns to Inanna are among the oldest known writings by a named author in human history. Through her words, we glimpse a mind reaching across millennia, weaving faith, power, and art into one. In the heart of every city, the temple stood as a beacon, not just a place of worship, but a symbol of the universe in miniature. The ziggurat, with its rising steps, represented the cosmic mountain, the axis connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. The king, in his role, was the stabilizing force, ensuring that this connection remained unbroken. Festivals and rituals reaffirmed this balance, from New Year ceremonies to the sacred marriage rite, in which the king symbolically wedded the goddess to renew the land's fertility. Kingship, then, was more than a political system. It was a reflection of cosmic truth. It was the earthly enactment of divine will, a sacred duty fraught with immense responsibility. And yet, beneath the grandeur, behind the tablets and walls, there were people, farmers, potters, builders, scribes, all living in the rhythm of a world shaped by gods and kings. As we continue deeper into the Sumerian world, we will explore their myths more closely, the stories of creation, of divine conflict, and of humanity's role in the grand design. For to understand Sumer is not just to learn of cities and kings, but to step into a worldview where everything, from the rising of the sun to the fall of a shadow, was part of a sacred story still unfolding. To understand the heart of the Sumerian mind, one must walk not only through their cities, but through their myths. These were not merely stories for entertainment. They were sacred truths, poetic reflections of how the world came to be and why it works as it does. The Sumerians saw the cosmos as a carefully ordered system, a living web of divine powers, each responsible for a part of existence. To live in harmony, they believed, one must understand and honor these forces. In the beginning, there was only the primordial sea, a watery chaos called Namu. From her depths emerged the first gods, the sky god An, the earth goddess Ki, and the air god Enlil. An and Ki gave birth to Enlil, who then separated the heavens from the earth. This act of separation was the first step in creating order from chaos, the founding act of the Sumerian cosmos. It was not a violent battle, as in later myths of other cultures, but a divine action of distinction and purpose. An, the god of the sky, became the distant ruler of the heavens, seldom involved directly with humanity. Ki, the earth, lay below, nurturing life. But it was Enlil who became the chief god in the Sumerian pantheon. He was the god of air, storms, and command, the enforcer of divine will and decrees. Enlil was both revered and feared. His decisions shaped destinies. His word was law. It was he who granted kingship to mortals, who raised cities, and who, in moments of wrath, could destroy them. Another key figure was Enki, also known as Ea in later traditions. He was the god of wisdom, fresh water, magic, and creation. Dwelling in the underground waters of the Abzu, Enki was the clever one, the trickster and helper of humankind. In many myths, when Enlil sought to punish humans, it was Enki who found ways to preserve them. He taught people how to farm, how to write, how to make bricks and build cities. His waters nourished the land, and his mind shaped knowledge itself. And then there was Inanna, goddess of love, war, beauty, and transformation. She was the daughter of either An or Enlil, depending on the tale, and her power was vast and untamed. Inanna embodied contradiction, fierce and seductive, tender and ruthless. She moved between worlds, descending into the underworld to confront her sister Ereshkigal in a tale of death and rebirth that would echo through many later mythologies. The descent of Inanna is one of the oldest and most profound stories of the ancient world. It tells of the goddess abandoning her temple and clothing, stripping away her power at each of the 7 gates to the underworld. There, she is judged, killed, and hung on a hook. But through the intervention of Enki, she is resurrected and returns to the world above. This myth is rich in symbolism, representing the cycles of nature, the journey of the soul, and the mystery of transformation through suffering. The underworld, ruled by Ereshkigal, was not a place of punishment, but a dim and silent realm where all the dead must eventually go. The Sumerians did not imagine a paradise or inferno. Rather, they saw the afterlife as a continuation of existence in a shadowy form. Offerings to the dead were vital to ensure they were not forgotten or left hungry. Life, death, and the space in between were all part of the same sacred rhythm. The Sumerians also believed that the gods held the me, the divine principles that governed all aspects of life. These were not physical laws, but sacred forces. Things like victory, wisdom, truth, and weaving. In one myth, Inanna journeys to Enki's temple in Eridu and convinces him through drink and charm to give her many of the me. She brings them back to Uruk, and thus civilization flourishes. This myth speaks of the passing of knowledge and the idea that culture itself is a divine gift, not a human invention. Even the calendar was a sacred structure. Time was divided not arbitrarily, but according to the movements of the moon and stars. Each festival aligned with the heavens. Each ritual echoed cosmic events. The Sumerians saw themselves as part of a grand cosmic order, not above nature, but within it. Every element of life, from harvesting barley to reciting a hymn, was a thread in the fabric of the universe. Their myths, written on clay tablets and passed through generations, were not just tales. They were instructions, reminders, and keys to understanding existence. The myths were performed in temple rituals, sung in sacred hymns, and etched into the walls of time itself. They were alive, changing with each telling, but always pointing back to the central truth, that the gods had shaped the world, and it was the duty of humans to live in balance with that divine design. As we journey onward, we will explore the daily lives of the Sumerians, their homes, their families, their festivals, and fears. For while their myths soared into the heavens, their feet remained planted in the soil between the rivers, where they built a world that still speaks through whispers of clay and shadow. The sun rose slowly over the plains of Sumer, casting a golden hue across mud-brick walls and temple spires. The cities Uruk, Lagash, and others stirred to life, their streets filling with the sounds of merchants, animals, and the steady rhythm of people at work. Life in these ancient cities was structured, orderly, and deeply intertwined with the divine. Every activity, from plowing a field to baking bread, was part of a larger cosmic dance. Homes were built from sun-dried bricks, simple rectangles with flat roofs, often clustered around courtyards. These courtyards were the heart of the household, where cooking, weaving, and socializing took place. Inside, the walls were plastered and painted. Clay ovens glowed softly, and oil lamps cast warm flickers against the cool interiors. Despite the simplicity of their materials, the homes were carefully constructed to withstand heat, sand, and time itself. Families were central to Sumerian society. A typical household included parents, children, extended relatives, and sometimes servants. Marriage was not romantic in the modern sense. It was a contract, an alliance, often arranged by families. The bride's family provided a dowry, and ceremonies were accompanied by offerings and feasts. Women held essential roles in the household, managing supplies, overseeing servants, and even participating in trade. Some served as priestesses or owned property in their own names. Children learned by observing, mimicking the work of their parents. Boys might learn to farm, craft, or write, depending on their family's status. Girls were often taught to spin, cook, and care for younger siblings. But for a select few, those chosen to become scribes' education was formal and rigorous. They attended the Adaba, or tablet house, where they learned to write cuneiform, memorize vast lists, and practice arithmetic and law. These scribes would go on to serve temples, palaces, and merchants, becoming the keepers of knowledge. The markets bustled with life. Barley, dates, fish, and wool changed hands daily. Artisans sold pottery, metal tools, and jewelry. There was no coinage. Everything was bartered or measured by weight in silver. Clay tablets kept records, receipts of grain deliveries, lists of temple offerings, contracts for land sales. The scribes, sitting with stylus and tablet, recorded the movements of an entire economy. The rhythm of trade was steady, a silent current flowing through the city. Temples dominated the skyline, towering structures at the center of each city. The ziggurat, a massive step pyramid, was both architectural marvel and spiritual axis. It was said to be the bridge between heaven and earth, the dwelling place of the gods. Only the high priests could enter the inner sanctum, where they bathed the statue of the god, dressed it, and offered food and incense daily. The people believed the god actually lived there, and that its favor was essential for the city's prosperity. Festivals marked the turning of the seasons. These were moments of joy, music, and communal worship. The whole city participated. Streets lined with banners, food shared among neighbors, dancers performing in honor of the gods. Each festival followed a sacred calendar, reenacting myths and renewing the bonds between heaven and earth. One of the most important was the Akitu, the New Year festival, where the king's legitimacy was reaffirmed and chaos was ritually banished to ensure order would continue. Justice was a pillar of daily life. Disputes were heard in public by judges or elders, and the principles of fairness were deeply embedded in the culture. Law codes existed, some written, others oral, and punishments were often harsh but meant to preserve balance. A stolen ox, a false oath, a broken contract, each had its consequence. The concept of ma'at, or divine order, though later more developed in Egypt, had its roots here in Sumerian thought as well. Religion was not just about temples and priests. It was woven into every part of life. Amulets hung by doors for protection. Offerings of food and drink were left at family altars. Prayers were whispered before sleep. People sought guidance through omens, the flight of birds, the patterns of oil in water, the entrails of sacrificed animals. Divination was a serious art, practiced by skilled specialists who read the language of the gods and the world around them. The Sumerians also had a rich tradition of music and poetry. Harps, lyres, flutes, and drums accompanied hymns and laments. Songs praised the gods, mourned the dead, or celebrated life's pleasures. Poetry was carved into tablets and recited aloud, words flowing like the Tigris itself. Enheduanna's hymns, for example, were not just religious texts, but works of deep beauty and spiritual intensity. echoing across time with a voice both ancient and alive. Life in Sumer was not easy. The rivers that gave them life also brought devastating floods. The sun scorched the land in summer, and enemies threatened from beyond the desert. But the people endured, adapting, rebuilding, and always looking to the gods for guidance. Their world was one of wonder, struggle, and invention. And though they did not yet know it, their efforts would echo far beyond the horizon of their own time, carried forward by the winds of history, etched forever in clay. In a world so tightly bound to the divine, the concept of law was never separate from the will of the gods. To the Sumerians, justice was not a human construct. It was a sacred principle that ensured balance between the heavens and the earth. When a king issued a decree, it was believed he was merely echoing the divine order. This view gave the law an almost spiritual authority and made the king its steward rather than its creator. The earliest legal codes emerged not from abstract philosophy, but from real concerns: the resolution of disputes, the protection of property, the regulation of temple obligations and labor. These were practical laws, born from daily life, yet rooted in the cosmic balance. Justice had to be done, and seen to be done, or the gods might withhold their favor, and chaos would creep in through the cracks. The laws were inscribed on clay tablets, and sometimes on stone steles placed in public spaces. Though the most famous code, the Code of Hammurabi, would come later in Babylon, its Sumerian predecessors laid the groundwork. One of the oldest known codes comes from the city of Ur, known as the Code of Ur-Nammu. Written around 2100 BCE, it addressed a wide range of matters: theft, marriage, slavery, injury, and more. The laws followed a pattern. If a man does this, then this shall happen. Simple, direct, and unequivocal. If a man caused harm to another, he paid a fine or received a punishment equal to his offense. If a person lied in court, they faced exile or death. These laws were not equal for all. Nobles, commoners, and slaves were treated differently. But the underlying idea was that a stable society required boundaries, and those boundaries had to be respected by all. Judges were appointed in each city, and trials were conducted with witnesses and oaths. A false oath swearing something untrue by the gods was among the gravest offenses. It wasn't merely lying, it was sacrilege, an insult to the divine order. The gods were believed to watch over the courts and to punish those who manipulated justice. Even kings were expected to abide by the law, and those who defied it were remembered not as strong rulers, but as tyrants cursed by the gods. The Sumerians also developed the concept of legal documentation. Contracts were written for marriages, loans, land sales, and even adoptions. These contracts were sealed with a cylinder sela, small carved stone rolled over wet clay to leave a unique imprint. This seal was a personal signature, a mark of identity and legitimacy. Even today, these ancient seals are found in the ruins of Sumer, delicate images of gods, humans, and animals, frozen forever in time. Through this system, the Sumerians created not just law, but trust, a way to conduct business, to form agreements, to protect what mattered. In a land where the rivers could flood without warning, and enemies could strike from the hills, the law was a kind of shelter, a framework that gave meaning and order to the unpredictable flow of life. Yet, law alone did not hold society together. It worked in tandem with belief, custom, and the deeply ingrained rhythm of communal life. Justice was also found in the stories people told, in the lessons passed down through generations, in the proverbs etched into tablets that still whisper their wisdom. Do not pass judgment when you are angry. Whoever has walked with truth generates life. May the one who speaks evil receive misfortune. These simple phrases reveal a world deeply attuned to the moral fabric that holds people together. They show that the Sumerians were not only the architects of cities and laws, but of conscience and community. The heart of each Sumerian city was its temple complex, a sacred precinct that housed not just the priests and offerings, but the very presence of the city's god. To the Sumerians, the gods were not distant ideals. They were immediate and involved, inhabiting the world and its people through daily rituals, symbols, and signs. The temple was not only a place of prayer, it was the center of life itself. At the highest point of the temple complex rose the ziggurat, a monumental step tower built of brick with a shrine at its summit. These structures loomed over the flat plains, visible from miles away, their tiers representing the cosmic ladder between earth and sky. Though the uppermost shrine was restricted to priests, the ziggurat itself was a symbol for Allah's visible reminder of the connection between the divine and the mortal. Each temple housed a divine statue, not as an idol, but as the actual dwelling place of the god. It was bathed, clothed, and fed daily, cared for with the attention one might give a living monarch. Priests and priestesses performed elaborate rituals to ensure the god remained pleased and present. Incense filled the chambers, music echoed from lyres and flutes, and sacred texts were recited in rhythmic chants. The temples were also economic centers. They owned land, employed laborers, collected offerings, and managed vast storehouses of grain and goods. The temple's workforce included not only priests, but scribes, administrators, guards, craftsmen, and cooks. Their records were meticulous, keeping track of every barley sack, every head of livestock, every ceremonial object crafted by hand. Inanna's temple in Uruk, the Enheduanna, was one of the grandest. Her cult was vibrant, her rituals ecstatic. As goddess of love and war, her worship reflected her complexity. Priestesses sang her praises in hymns that still survive, celebrating her beauty, her wrath, her power to bring fertility and destruction. To the Sumerians, love and conflict were not opposites. They were twin forces, both sacred and necessary. Temples were also centers of healing. Herbs, rituals, and incantations were used to treat ailments. Illness was often seen as a spiritual imbalance, a punishment or warning from the gods. Healing required both physical and spiritual intervention, a prayer alongside a poultice, a charm as well as a medicine. The priests, in this sense, were not only keepers of divine favor, but guardians of well-being. The temple festivals were some of the most significant events in the Sumerian calendar. These were not only religious moments, but civic ones, uniting the people in shared experience. Processions filled the streets. Sacred objects were carried on carts adorned with flowers and cloth. Songs were sung from rooftops. And even the king played a role, reenacting myths and rituals meant to renew the land's vitality. The most sacred of these rituals was the sacred marriage, a symbolic union between the king and the high priestess, representing the marriage between the god and goddess. In this rite, human actors stood in for the divine, enacting a mythic union that ensured fertility for the crops, animals, and people. This was not merely a performance. It was a powerful spiritual act, believed to align heaven and earth once more. These temples, their rituals, their music and symbols, they formed the very soul of Sumer. To walk into the temple precinct was to step into the timeless, into a space where the boundary between mortal and immortal grew thin. It was a place where stories became real, where the world was shaped not by stone and mud alone, but by prayer, purpose, and belief. Amid the bustle of temple courtyards and the quiet order of palace halls, there moved a unique class of people, those who held the power to capture time itself. They were the scribes, guardians of memory, craftsmen of language, and masters of the written word. In the world of Sumer, where gods ruled from unseen heights and kings served divine will, the scribes gave permanence to fleeting breath and moment, inscribing the clay with signs that would outlive their makers by millennia. The invention of writing marked a turning point in human history. At first, it was simple: pictographs scratched into wet clay to keep track of goods, rations, and temple stores. But slowly, these signs became more abstract, more versatile. They evolved into cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped marks made with a stylus pressed into soft clay. Over time, cuneiform could record not only numbers and transactions, but thoughts, prayers, stories, laws, and dreams. To become a scribe was to enter a world of complexity and prestige. Training began in childhood, within the Adubith tablet house, where students spent long hours memorizing signs, copying texts, and learning the principles of mathematics, law, and administration. The school tablets recovered by archaeologists are filled with practice exercises, lines repeated again and again. The hand of a boy growing more sure with each stroke, each symbol etched with care and repetition. Scribes served in every corner of Sumerian life. In temples, they recorded offerings, rituals, and celestial observations. In palaces, they documented taxes, decrees, and treaties. In courts, they wrote down proceedings and transcribed verdicts. In the markets, they registered contracts, loans, and exchanges. Without the scribe, the machinery of society would falter, for in a world of clay and fire, memory had to be made durable. The language they wrote, Sumerian, was unique, unrelated to any other language, ancient or modern. It was complex, filled with nuance, tone, and metaphor. Later, when the Akkadians came, Sumerian would continue as a scholarly and liturgical language, preserved in the temples, much like Latin centuries later. The scribes wrote not just for practicality, but for beauty. They composed hymns, proverbs, epics, and laments, literature born from a civilization's soul. Among the most remarkable literary achievements was the Epic of Gilgamesh, composed and refined over centuries. Though the most complete version comes from later Akkadian tablets, its roots are deeply Sumerian. This story, carved in clay and passed through ages, follows the mighty king of Uruk on his journey through grief, friendship, and the quest for immortality. Through Gilgamesh's trials, the scribes explored questions that still haunt the human mind. What is the purpose of life? What lies beyond death? How can one find peace? The scribes preserved myths, too, sacred stories that framed the world in divine meaning, tales of Enki and Ninma, shaping humans from clay, of Inanna's descent into the underworld, of the great flood that wiped away an earlier age of man. Each story was more than narrative. It was a thread in the tapestry of understanding, tying the present to the mythic past. They also wrote laments, sorrowful poems mourning the fall of cities, the anger of the gods, the suffering of people. These texts are haunting, filled with aching detail and ritual cadence. When the city of fell centuries later, its destruction was remembered not only through ruins but through words. The lament for stands as one of the oldest elegies known, its voice echoing through clay and time. Through their tablets, the scribes ensured that no story was lost, that no law faded, that no name vanished without trace. They were both recorders and creators. They shaped not only how people remembered, but what they remembered. The thousands of tablets they left behind are now windows into a world long gone, yet vividly alive. Each time a stylus was pressed into wet clay, a choice was made, a moment crystallized. And now, thousands of years later, those clay fragments whisper to us across time, not with voices of power or war, but with the steady hands of those who wrote not for glory, but for memory. In dusty archives, in shattered ruins, their words endure. Delicate and powerful, soft as breath, strong as stone. Beyond the sacred walls and temple courtyards, Sumer was not an isolated cradle of civilization. It was the beating heart of an ever-expanding network of trade, a crossroads of goods, ideas, and culture. Though the land between the rivers was rich in mud and water, it lacked many natural resources. No precious metals, no timber, no stone. And so, the Sumerians looked outward, reaching beyond the horizon, crafting trade routes that stretched across deserts, rivers, and seas. Boats carved their way down the Euphrates and Tigris, gliding through winding channels toward the Persian Gulf. There, Sumerian merchants embarked upon voyages to distant lands. To Dilmun, Magan, and Meluhaplaces, we now associate with Bahrain, Oman, and the Indus Valley. These journeys brought in copper, timber, gold, carnelian, ivory, and exotic animals. In return, the Sumerians offered wool, textiles, barley, dates, and crafted goods, as well as their knowledge of writing and measurement. Trade was a sacred activity, often overseen by temple officials. Caravans were dispatched with care, guided by contracts sealed in clay and prayers whispered for safe passage. Donkeys, laden with cargo, made their slow trek across sun-blasted plains. In the bustling markets of and Uruk, these goods were unloaded, tallied, and exchanged, not through coin, but through silver weighed on scales and measured against fixed standards. The merchants were not mere traders, they were cultural ambassadors. Through them flowed not only physical goods, but stories, technologies, and beliefs. Pottery styles, cylinder seals, and even mythological motifs from Sumer found their way into far-off lands, while foreign influences subtly reshaped local customs. It was through this flow that the seeds of interconnected civilization were sown, long before modern borders or maps. Sumerian cities themselves were structured for commerce. Canals linked fields to storehouses, and storehouses to docks. Granaries rose beside workshops where weavers, potters, and metalworkers transformed raw materials into finished goods. Every item, every tool, every basket, every strand of dyed wool had its place in the economic system, and behind it all was the silent script of cuneiform, keeping record, noting debt, marking promise. The temples, too, were powerful economic engines. Their vast landholdings were cultivated by tenant farmers who paid in kind or labor. Herds of livestock grazed temple pastures. Skilled artisans crafted ritual vessels, sacred figurines, and ornate garments, all funded and directed by temple administrators. The line between religious duty and economic necessity was not sharp, it was all part of a single divine order. To work for the temple was to work for the gods themselves. One of the most important centers of trade was the city of Uruk, with its prominent harbor and ziggurat rising above the landscape. It became a hub for exchange between Sumer and the wider world. The wealth of Uruk is evident in the archaeological finds from its royal cemetery burials filled with gold, lapis lazuli, finely crafted weapons, musical instruments, and ceremonial objects of stunning beauty. These treasures were not only signs of affluence, but symbols of a civilization that saw itself at the center of a divine and worldly web. Yet even in the marketplace, the spiritual was present. Merchants might make offerings to Nanshi, goddess of justice and trade, before setting out on a journey. They prayed for fair dealings and safe travels. Temples were often built near harbors. Their presence a reminder that commerce, like the river, flowed best when aligned with cosmic order. Economy in Sumer was not only about goods, but about time. Work followed the agricultural calendar, planting in spring, harvest in autumn, rest and ritual in between. Taxation came not in coin, but in grain, oil, and livestock. Labor was measured in days owed to the state or temple. A complex system of loans and interest developed, regulated by contract and oath. If a farmer borrowed seed and failed to repay, he risked losing his land or even his freedom. Debt could lead to bondage, and yet there were also laws for protection. Certain years might be declared clean slates when debts were forgiven and lands returned. This, too, was part of maintaining balance, ensuring that wealth did not corrupt the structure of society beyond repair. The Sumerians understood that prosperity was a delicate cycle, one that required vigilance and sacred attention. The wealth of Sumer was never just material. It was a wealth of connection, of ideas shared across great distances, of human enterprise woven into the land itself. In every grain stored, in every seal pressed into clay, in every distant ship docking at a Sumerian port, there echoed the quiet brilliance of a people who had turned a floodplain into a living network, both humble and grand. As the sun set behind the ziggurats and cast long shadows over the canals and rooftops, another kind of work began. The priests and priestesses climbed to high platforms, not just to pray, but to observe. For the Sumerians, the sky was more than a canvas of starset. It was a divine map, a clock, and a voice. The heavens were alive with meaning, and every movement of a planet or flicker of a star was considered a message from the gods. They were among the first to map the stars systematically, tracking the paths of the moon and planets across the sky. Their observations were recorded on clay tablets, marking eclipses, solstices, and conjunctions. From these patterns, they developed a calendar based on lunar cycles, aligning months with phases of the moon and seasons with the rhythm of planting and harvest. Time was sacred, not abstract, but a living measure of the God's will unfolding across the earth. They divided the day and night into equal parts, eventually developing a base 60 system that still lives on in how we tell time: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. This sexagesimal system, born from practical and sacred calculations, allowed them to measure with great precision. It was applied not only to time, but to geometry, to land division, to astronomical tables. Their understanding of numbers was not cold mathematics, it was infused with symbolism and ritual. The Sumerians believed that numbers themselves carried divine properties. Certain numbers, such as 7, 12, and 60, were seen as especially potent. The number 7, for instance, appears again and again in their myth: 7 gates to the underworld, 7 sages sent by the gods, 7 days of mourning, 12 months, each sacred, guided the year. 60 was the number of Un, the sky god, the highest in their divine hierarchy. By observing the stars, the Sumerians believed they could foresee the future. Divination through celestial phenomena was an integral part of their worldview. A red moon might portend war. A bright star near a certain constellation could signal abundance. The priests who studied the sky were not mere astronomers. They were mediators between heaven and earth, reading the will of the gods written in constellations and shadow. But they also applied these observations practically. The calendar ensured that agricultural cycles stayed in harmony with seasonal changes. By knowing when to plant and when to reap, the Sumerians could store food, predict shortages, and organize labor. This precision in timing was essential in a land where nature could be both generous and cruel. Their understanding of the cosmos was a tool for survival and a form of worship. They built observatories atop their temples, simple, open-air platforms that allowed clear views of the horizon. Here, they marked the rising and setting points of stars, traced the paths of Venus and Jupiter, and anticipated eclipses with growing accuracy. Over centuries, this knowledge was refined, expanded, and passed on. Later civilizations from the Babylonians to the Greeks would build on these foundations, but the roots remained in the cities of Sumer. Mathematics too blossomed from this sacred inquiry. They developed multiplication tables, geometric calculations, and algorithms for dividing fields. Clay tablets filled with calculations have been uncovered demonstrating not only practical problem solving, but abstract reasoning. They understood square roots, reciprocal numbers, and equations. They measured the height of ziggurats, the volume of grain, the angles of fields. Their knowledge was both earthly and celestial. This blend of science and spirituality defined their approach to the world. For them, knowledge was never detached from meaning. To measure the stars was to hear the gods. To divide land was to honor the earth. Even illness or misfortune could be diagnosed through ritual and observation, sometimes celestial, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through the patterns in smoke or the liver of a sacrificed animal. Nothing was random. Everything was part of a greater pattern. In their temples, numbers were not simply tools, they were offerings. In sacred texts, they described the universe as being woven together with measure and proportion. Harmony was not just musical, it was mathematical, a balance of forces, a resonance between what is above and what is below. The Sumerians saw themselves within that harmony, their role to keep the music playing, the cycles unbroken. As night deepened over the city and the fires burned low, the priest-scribes still watched the stars. Above them, the constellations moved silently, eternally, and below, the clay tablets grew heavy with knowledge. In this sacred union of sky and earth, the Sumerians carved their legacy not only into temples and walls, but into the very fabric of human understanding. In the libraries of clay tablets unearthed from Sumerian ruins, there exists a tale, haunting, familiar, and enduring. It tells of a great flood, a deluge so vast it wiped clean the earth and all its creatures. This story is one of the oldest written memories of cataclysm in human history, and it echoes not only through Sumer, but through Babylonian, Hebrew, and countless other traditions across time. In its earliest form, it appears in the Sumerian tale of Ziusudratha, a man who survived the flood and spoke with the gods. According to the ancient texts, there was once a time when the gods grew weary of mankind. Perhaps they were too noisy, or too numerous, or perhaps the divine order had been disturbed. Enlil, the god of air and command, decided to cleanse the world with a great flood. But Enki, the god of wisdom and water, took pity on humanity. He whispered to a man, Ziusudra, warning him of the coming deluge and instructing him to build a boat. Ziusudra obeyed. He constructed a massive vessel, sealed it with pitch, and filled it with animals and provisions. When the flood came, it swallowed cities, temples, and fields. The rivers merged with the sky, and for 7 days and nights, the world was water and silence. Then, as the waters receded, the boat came to rest. And Ziusudra, emerging into a cleansed world, offered sacrifices to the gods. The gods, moved by his devotion, granted him eternal life in a distant paradise. This tale, preserved in fragments, is not only a myth, it is a memoria cultural scar, carried by a civilization that had witnessed floods not just as natural disasters, but as existential threats. Living between two unpredictable rivers, the Sumerians understood the raw power of water. Entire cities could vanish overnight, leaving only wet clay and silence. The flood narrative was more than a cautionary tale. It was an explanation, a framework for understanding the cycles of destruction and rebirth that governed not only nature, but society. It spoke of divine justice, of moral testing, of hidden mercy. Later, in Babylonian mythology, this story would evolve into the epic of Atrahasis, and then into the tale of Utnapishtim in the epic of Gilgamesh. Each iteration carrying the same core: survival, obedience, and the promise of renewal. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that great floods did occur in Mesopotamia. Layers of silt and destruction found beneath ancient cities tell of sudden, devastating inundations. Whether these events were localized or massive, they left an indelible mark on the Sumerian psyche. And like all great civilizations, the Sumerians transformed trauma into mythology, turning water into symbol and survival into sacred destiny. The flood also played a role in their understanding of kingship. The Sumerian king list, a semi-mythical document chronicling the reigns of kings before and after the flood, marks the deluge as a turning point. Kingship was first granted before the flood to the city of Eridu, but after the flood, it descended again from heaven, this time to Kish. This transition represents a kind of divine reset, a chance for humanity to begin anew under new order and law. In this way, the flood was not only an end, but a beginning, a great pause in time, a space cleared for the gods to shape the world again. The survivors, like Ziusudra, became figures of deep reverence, their names whispered in temple hymns and carved into sacred tablets. They were not just heroes, they were bridges between worlds, between the old and the new, the lost and the reborn. The Sumerians understood that water gave life and took it away. They mastered irrigation, turned rivers into channels, transformed deserts into gardens, but they also feared water's untamed force. The flood myths served to remind them of this balance, of humanity's place, not as masters of nature, but as guests within it, always at the mercy of its tides, always striving to appease the unseen currents that ruled sky and soil. And so, the tale of Ziusudra endures, not because it was the first story of its kind, but because it touched something universal: the fear of loss, the hope of salvation, the belief that even in the face of overwhelming destruction, there might be a chance to begin again. With each retelling, the story deepened. A vessel not just of survival, but of memory, floating forever in the great river of time. On the banks of the Euphrates, Under the gaze of the moon and the watchful eyes of temple priests, the city of Ur rose in splendor. Among all the cities of ancient Sumer, Ur would become one of the most powerful and enduring. Its ziggurat towered over the land, a stairway to the heavens, while its streets bustled with traders, craftsmen, and scribes. This was a place of culture, faith, and royal power. A shining jewel in the crown of early civilization, Ur was sacred to Inanna, the moon god. His light, soft and steady, guided travelers at night and marked the passage of time in the heavens. Inanna's temple was vast, with courtyards, shrines, and chambers where priests tracked lunar cycles, performed nightly rituals, and watched for signs in the stars. The moon governed their calendar. It lit their myths and marked their ceremonies. In Ur, the moon was not distant, it was present, rhythmic, alive. But it was not only the gods who defined the greatness of Uruk, was its kings. One of the most famed dynasties in all of Sumerian history was the third dynasty of Ur, often called Ur III, which reigned during the 20th century BCE. These kings, especially Ur-Nammu and his successors, brought order, unity, and prosperity to the region after a period of fragmentation and decline. They weren't just warriors, they were builders, reformers, visionaries. Ur-Nammu is remembered for issuing one of the earliest known legal codes. His laws, written in Sumerian and inscribed on tablets, reflected a concern for justice, structure, and social harmony. He ordered the construction of the Grand Ziggurat of Ur, a layered pyramid of mud brick and bitumen that still rises today above the ruins. This structure was more than architecture. It was a monument to divine connection, a symbol of Sumer's resilience and aspiration. The kings of Ur III ruled over a bureaucratic state that kept meticulous records. Tablets from this period reveal a tightly organized society, with officials tracking food rations, workforce assignments, tax collections, and temple rituals. The central government coordinated agriculture, managed state labor, and oversaw the movement of goods across a vast network. It was a high point in Sumerian administration, a time when the dream of a united land seemed close to reality. Ur's rulers styled themselves not only as kings of Sumer, but as guardians of divine will. They invoked Enlil's blessing and maintained temples to every major deity. Their inscriptions often credited their achievements not to ambition, but to obedience, framing their conquests, reforms, and construction projects as acts of service to the gods. Through these claims, they shaped not only policy but memory. The king was not above the law. He was its instrument. Yet even in times of glory, shadows lingered. The kings of Ur ruled over a complex society that depended on layers of labor. Slaves, debt servants, and captured peoples worked the fields and built the temples. There were inequalities, tensions, and periodic rebellions. The grandeur of the palaces did not erase the hardship of those whose hands lifted the bricks and pressed the tablets. Despite this, the cultural life of Ur flourished. Music filled its courts, poetry echoed through its temples, and its scribes preserved a vast corpus of literature. The royal cemetery of Ur, excavated in the 20th century, revealed astonishing treasures: golden lyres, headdresses of lapis and carnelian, finely crafted weapons and ornaments buried with nobles and retainers. These burials, rich and symbolic, tell of a society that believed in the continuity of existence beyond death, a realm where kings and gods walked side by side. Among those buried was a woman named Puabia Queen, or High Priestess, whose lavish grave goods speak of extraordinary status. Her tomb contained musical instruments, jewelry, and a wealth of crafted artifacts, all buried alongside attendants who may have been sacrificed to serve her in the afterlife. It's a chilling yet fascinating window into the intersection of power, faith, and ritual. Ur would shine for centuries, its influence spreading across Mesopotamia. But like all cities, it was not immune to the tides of time. Invasions, droughts, and shifting trade routes would eventually dim its light. And yet, its legacy lived on in its ruins, in its stories, in the language that once shaped the world between two rivers. The city of Ur remains a symbol of all that the Sumerians achieved: their order, their beauty, their relentless pursuit of meaning beneath the watchful gaze of the stars. While Ur, Uruk, and Eridu stood tall in the historical record, countless other Sumerian cities once thrived along the arteries of the Tigris and Euphrates. Their names now half lost to time, their stones buried beneath fields of dust and sand. These were cities of equal devotion, industry, and memory, each with its own gods, its own myths, its own rhythm. Cities like Lagash, Nippur, Adab, and Shuruppak form the complex mosaic of Sumer, each contributing threads to the grand tapestry of civilization. Lagash was one such city, powerful, prosperous, and pious. It flourished in the late 3rd millennium BCE and was ruled by kings like Enheduanna and Gudea, who left behind detailed inscriptions and statues that still bear the quiet echo of their ambition. Gudea, in particular, commissioned numerous temples and works of art. His statues show a man of deep contemplation, hands clasped, eyes wide, the very image of a ruler in prayer. His texts speak not of conquest, but of devotion, of dreams sent by the gods, and of a king who listened. Gudea claimed that the god Ningirsu had given him divine instruction in a vision, showing him the plans for a new temple. With reverence, he followed these commands, gathering materials from far-off lands, cedar wood from Lebanon, diorite from Oman, copper from the mountains of Anatolia. In building the temple, he did not seek fame, but harmony, restoring the balance between earth and heaven, between human labor and divine favor. Nippur, another key city, held a special place in the spiritual heart of Sumer. Though it was never a capital in the political sense, it was the religious center of the region. Here stood the grand temple of Enlil, the god of wind and destiny. Kings from across Sumer would journey to Nippur to receive Enlil's blessing, legitimizing their rule. Even foreign rulers recognized its spiritual power. Control of Nippur meant divine approval. It was the ceremonial throne of the Sumerian cosmos. Shuruppak, too, held an essential role. According to legend, it was the home of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, and one of the last cities to fall before the Great Flood. Its ruins tell of a city planned with care houses arranged in neat rows, evidence of organized water management, and tablets bearing early examples of wisdom literature. Among these is the Instructions of Shuruppak, a father's advice to his son, filled with proverbs that resonate across time. Do not speak arrogantly to your mother. Do not steal. Respect the road, the river, and the field. These simple words, etched in clay, capture the heartbeat of a civilization grounded not only in law and ritual, but in everyday wisdom. The kind passed from parent to child beneath the flickering light of an oil lamp. Many of these cities are known to us only through fragments. A few tablets, a crumbling wall, a statue broken at the waist. Time has not been kind to them. The rivers shifted. The earth swallowed their streets. Sandstorms buried their ziggurats. And yet, within the soil, their voices remain. The clay holds memory. Every excavation brings up echoes. A bead from a necklace, a cylinder seal once rolled across soft clay, a name half erased whispering from a shattered tablet. These forgotten cities remind us that Sumer was not a monolith, but a constellation, each city-state a star, flickering with its own light, tracing its own path through the ancient sky. Rivalries existed, battles for land, for water, for honor, but so did connection. Messengers moved between temples. Scribes copied texts and carried them far. Artisans traveled with skills honed over generations. And beneath all this, the land itself breathed with memory. The canals they dug now lie dry, but their patterns remain like scars across the plain. The same sun that warmed the bricks of Lagash still rises over the fields. The wind still whispers through the reeds, carrying with it the dreams of 1,000 cities, most of which will never be known by name. But in every recovered fragment, in every quiet mound that once echoed with life, the spirit of Sumer continues, not loud, not boastful, but steady, patient, enduring. The temples may have crumbled, but their foundations rest not only in earth, but in you etched into the deep story of what it means to build, to believe, and to remember. To the Sumerians, death was not the end, but neither was it a glorious escape to paradise. It was a quiet, shadowy transition into a world beneath the earth, a realm not of fire or torment, but of silence, dust, and dim remembrance. They called it Kurthland, of no return, a place where the dead lived on in a kind of muted existence, surrounded by stone and darkness, drinking water if it was left for them, and fading slowly if it was not. The dead were buried with care, surrounded by tokens of their lives, bowls, tools, ornaments, food, and even small statues. Wealthy individuals might be buried in elaborate tombs with gold, silver, and attendants, while the poor were laid to rest in simpler graves, often beneath the floors of their homes. Regardless of class, the act of burial was a deeply sacred ritual. It ensured that the dead found their place in Kur, and that the living honored their obligations. In Sumerian belief, if the dead were not properly buried or remembered, their spirits could grow restless, wandering the earth, hungry, angry, forgotten. To prevent this, families would make regular offerings, pouring water, leaving bread, lighting oil lamps. These small gestures were acts of love, duty, and survival, for both the living and the dead depended on memory to preserve their connection. The journey to the afterlife was thought to be difficult. In myths, we read of the soul descending through 7 gates, the same gates Inanna passed on her way to confront her sister, Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. At each gate, the soul gave up something: clothing, jewels, power, until it stood bare before the throne of judgment. What awaited there was not punishment, but permanence, a place among the countless others who had gone before. Funeral rites were guided by ritual and custom. The body was washed, anointed, and wrapped in cloth. Priests might chant sacred words, while family members wept and recited laments. These laments were more than expressions of grief. They were keys, designed to open the gates of Kur and guide the soul safely downward. Some tablets preserve these laments in beautiful, poetic language. Mournful lines that speak of love, loss, and the ache of separation. One of the most astonishing discoveries about Sumerian death practices comes from the royal cemetery of Uruk. Here, archaeologists found not only individual tombs, but entire burial complexes, vaults filled with treasures, sacrifices, and attendants buried alongside the elite. In Queen Puabi's tomb, for example, dozens of servants and guards were found laid out in precise rows, accompanied by lyres, jewelry, and ceremonial goods. It is believed these individuals died or were killed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. Such practices speak to a belief in a continuation of life beyond death, a social structure that mirrored the living world. Kings would still need servants, queens would still wear crowns, music would still be played, and yet the underworld was not a paradisite, was still Kur, beautiful perhaps in moments, but always silent, always distant. Texts describing Kur depict it as a realm behind a set of mountains ruled by Ereshkigal and served by a court of chthonic spirits. Once a soul entered, there was no return. Even the gods themselves could not move freely between realms. Only Inanna dared to descend and rise again, and even she paid a price. The laws of death were immutable. The cycle could not be broken. What mattered then was not to avoid death, but to meet it with ritual, with preparation, and with remembrance. For those left behind, grief was formalized. Laments were sung publicly, inscribed on tablets, and passed down across generations. Cities even composed collective laments after disasters or invasion, songs of mourning for their temples, their gods, their people. These poetic texts give voice not only to sorrow but to resilience. They say, "We remember, we grieve, and we continue." The Sumerians did not build pyramids. They did not mummify their dead or prepare golden boats for their journey, but they buried their loved ones beneath their homes, close, familiar, never fully gone. And in doing so, they kept the bonds of memory alive, ensuring that even in the land of dust, a soul might feel the warmth of the living, carried forward in ritual, in whisper, and in the gentle flicker of a flame. Among the many voices that rose from the temples and palaces of ancient Sumer, one stands above the rest, not in myth, but in name. Her name was Enheduanna. She was not only a high priestess of the moon god Inanna in the city of she was also a poet, a theologian, and the first known person in human history to sign their literary work. Through her hymns and prayers, we glimpse not just the beliefs of her people, but the soul of a single individual, speaking across more than 4,000 years. Enheduanna lived during the reign of her father, Sargon of Akkad, who forged the first empire in Mesopotamian history by uniting Sumer and Akkad under a single rule. To help stabilize this new union, Sargon appointed his daughter as Entu priestess of one of the most powerful religious offices in Sumer. In this role, Enheduanna became the bridge between old and new, between local deities and imperial authority, between the divine and the mortal. But she was more than a political figure. She was a writer of astonishing depth. Her most famous composition, the Exaltation of Inanna, also known as In Sagura, is a hymn of praise, supplication, and intimate dialogue with the goddess. It speaks of power, exile, despair, and hope. It tells how Enheduanna was cast out of her position by political enemies, left to wander and cry to the heavens, and how, through prayer and devotion, she found strength and restoration. In her verses, Enheduanna does something extraordinary. She writes not only of gods and rituals, but of her own self. She says, "I, Enheduanna." She places herself in the story, not as a mere instrument of divine will, but as a human being conflicted, emotional, reaching, Her hymns become personal, lyrical, deeply felt. She honors Inanna not just as a deity of war and love, but as a force that transforms suffering into purpose. Through Enheduanna's poetry, we also glimpse the richness of Sumerian religion. Inanna is not one-dimensional. She is fierce and kind, terrifying and nurturing. The goddess is invoked in language that is sensual, mystical, and profound. The temple becomes a space of divine encounter, where the veil between human and God dissolves in music, incense, and voice. And Enheduanna becomes the voice of that encounter, shaping belief through word and song. Her legacy endured long after her death. Copies of her hymns were found in schools and libraries for centuries, studied by scribes and chanted in temples. Her works became part of the religious curriculum of the land. That her name survived at alleged in cuneiform across time is a testament to her significance. In a world where most authors remained anonymous, where even kings often signed only with titles, Enheduanna stands alone as a named creator. She wrote more than just the exaltation of Inanna. Her temple hymns form a kind of spiritual geography, a collection of poems dedicated to temples throughout Sumer. In each, she praises the architecture, the deities, the rituals, and the sacred functions of these places. They are more than hymns. They are poetic maps of holiness, tracing the pulse of the land through its spiritual centers. Her life was not without struggle. As a priestess, she held enormous influence, but that power also made her a target. The hymns themselves hint at political upheaval, at exile, and the fragile nature of status in a world of gods and men. Yet her response was not silence or retreat. It was creation. She wrote. She praised. She endured. Through her voice, the divine was not only distant and awe-inspiring, it was also immediate, present, and compassionate. Today, Enheduanna is more than a historical figure. She is a reminder that the human desire to express, to remember, to shape experience through language is ancient and universal. She stands at the dawn of authorship, her clay tablets whispering not only of gods, but of herself, a woman with a name, a mind, and a voice that still speaks. In the dust of ruined temples and the fragments of forgotten cities, her words endure, graceful and defiant, soft as prayer, sharp as truth, bridging millennia with the power of a single human soul. At the center of Sumerian life, interwoven into every harvest, every temple, every prayer, stood the gods. Not distant deities watching from afar, but living presences believed to inhabit the very cities named for them. Each god had a domain, a role in the cosmic order, and a home in the world of men. Their personalities were not abstract ideals. They were rich, complex, and vividly human in their desires, their wrath, their tenderness, and the sky god sat atop the divine hierarchy. He was the father of the gods, the distant authority whose decrees shaped the destinies of both mortals and immortals. Though his role became more symbolic over time, An was still invoked in royal inscriptions and temple rituals. His name opened prayers. His authority was the final word. He was the sky above, eternal and silent. Enlil, the god of air and command, was perhaps the most powerful in practice. He governed the destinies of kings and cities, issued divine decrees, and held the tablets of fate. Enlil was often stern, his decisions irreversible. He was the god who unleashed the flood in the Sumerian tradition. Yet he also bestowed kingship and prosperity. His temple at Nippur, the Yekur, was the holiest site in all of Sumer. by generations of rulers who sought his blessing. Enki, the god of water, wisdom, and creation, was a contrast to Enlil's severity. Dwelling in the underground freshwater sea called the Abzu, Enki was clever, compassionate, and endlessly inventive. He fashioned humans from clay to lighten the burden of the gods, gave life to rivers and fields, and preserved balance through insight rather than command. In myth after myth, Enki intervenes to soften fate, finding solutions where others see only punishment. Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and transformation, brought fire and passion into the pantheon. Her energy was wild, untamed, and unpredictable. She could seduce and destroy, heal and rage, bless and curse in the same breath. Her descent into the underworld, her conquests in myth, and her complex relationship with mortals made her one of the most beloved and feared deities. She stood for the fullness of life, its pleasures, its pain, its endless need to become more. Utu, the sun god, brought light and justice. He watched over contracts, oaths, and trials. Each day he rose from the eastern mountains, journeyed across the sky, and descended into the western underworld, where he judged the dead before rising once more. His light was not just warmth, but truth, that exposing lies, revealing wrongs. Judges invoked his name when rendering decisions, believing his presence ensured fairness. Nana, the moon god and father of Utu and Inanna, was the guiding light of night. He ruled the rhythms of time, his phases marking the calendar, his cycles determining festivals and rituals. His temple at was among the most sacred, and his worship linked astronomy with devotion. The soft glow of the moon was seen as his blessing, a sign of stability, of quiet watchfulness in a world that never fully slept. Ningirsu, god of war and agriculture, protected the city of Lagash. He embodied both the strength to fight and the wisdom to cultivate. He was honored in grand temples built by rulers like Gudea, who claimed to receive divine instructions in dreams. Ningirsu's myths depict him as a warrior slaying chaotic beasts, but also as a patron of irrigation, ensuring that the land remained fruitful. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, reigned in the realm of Kur. She was not evil, but absolute. She kept the dead in her domain and upheld the final separation between life and death. Her palace was a place of stillness and dust, her voice rarely heard above ground. Only once, when Inanna descended, did her story unfold in the world above, a tale of judgment, loss, and eventual return. Ninlil, consort of Enlil, was goddess of air and grain. She shared her husband's domain, but brought gentleness and fertility. Her myths connect deeply to the land, to motherhood, to the rhythms of planting and growth. Her presence balanced Enlil's command, turning wind from storm to breath. The pantheon of Sumer was vast, with hundreds of deities worshipped in local shrines and major temples. Each had their own stories, their own songs. Some protected professions: craftsmen, sailors, shepherds. Others guarded place rivers, mountains, city walls. The gods were everywhere and in everything. To the Sumerians, the world was not ruled by chance. Every outcome had a divine source, every misfortune a message, every blessing a gift. They did not worship to please capricious beings, but to maintain harmonido, ensure that their place in the cosmos remained secure. The gods did not demand perfection, but attention. They asked to be remembered, honored, understood. And so the people prayed, built, sang, and in doing so, They created a civilization shaped not just by brick and law, but by myth and mystery. A world where the divine walked with the living, and where every star in the night sky was not just light, but a name, a story, a god. Though the Sumerians revered harmony and divine order, their land was no stranger to conflict. The very nature of their civilization-independent city-states, each with its own ruler, god, and ambition, made war an almost inevitable part of life. And while they built canals and temples, they also built armies, fortified walls, and weapons of bronze. War, for the Sumerians, was as much a part of the divine cycle as harvest or flood. The earliest wars were likely over water and land. In a region where rainfall was scarce and survival depended on complex irrigation systems, access to canals and fertile fields meant life or death. Cities like Lagash and Umma frequently clashed over disputed territory. These weren't distant, large-scale wars, but tightly focused, deeply personal struggles between neighbors, fought with spears, axes, and bows, and justified in the name of their respective gods. One of the most famous early conflicts is recorded in inscriptions from the city of Lagash. During the rule of King Inanna, Lagash defeated its rival Umma in a war that was memorialized on the stele of the Vulturesa stone slab, carved with vivid scenes of battle. On one side, rows of soldiers march in disciplined formation. On another, vultures pick at the bodies of the slain. The message is clear. The gods of Lagash granted victory, and the price of defiance was high. The stele of the vultures also offers a glimpse into how war was viewed. It was not simply conquest, it was justice, retribution, divine will in action. When a city violated a treaty or encroached upon land, it was seen not just as aggression, but as sacrilege. The gods of the offended city would call for reparation, and if it was not given, war would follow, sanctioned by temples and guided by priests. Despite this sacred framing, war was often brutal. Sieges were common. Cities were surrounded, their food supplies cut off, their gates battered until they fell. Temples could be looted, statues of gods taken as spoils of war, not destroyed, but removed, for their power was respected even by enemies. The act of returning a divine statue to its rightful home could end a war or mark a formal peace. Weapons were crafted with care and ritual. Bronze was molded into blades, maces, and helmets. Shields of wood and leather protected warriors in close combat. Chariots, primitive by later standards, were sometimes used in open terrain, but most battles were hand-to-hand affairs, fought on flat plains or narrow streets. The armies were not professional standing forces, but levied from the population. Farmers and artisans called to fight for their gods and city. After battles, treaties might be carved into stone, marking the terms of peace and reaffirming boundaries. These were often overseen by temple authorities, reinforcing the idea that peace was as sacred as war, but peace was rarely permanent. The rise and fall of city-states was a rhythm that pulsed through Sumerian history, each generation facing the same challenge to defend what was theirs, and to take what they believed was divinely ordained. As cities grew stronger, some rulers dreamed of uniting the fractured land under a single banner. The first to achieve this was Lugal-Zaghazi, king of Umma, who conquered several cities and declared himself king of Sumer. But his reign was short-lived. A new power was rising in the north, one that would forever change the fate of Sumer Akkad. Sargon of Akkad, a Semitic-speaking ruler from humble beginnings, swept down from the north and defeated Lugal-Zaghazi. He captured Uruk, and Nippur, forging the first true empire in Mesopotamian history. Sargon did not destroy Sumer, he absorbed it, ruling through a new capital but preserving much of Sumerian culture and religion. His empire marked a new chapter, one in which the Sumerians were no longer alone at the top of the world. Though Sumerian city-states continued to resist and rise, the age of independent cities ruling themselves had passed. The gods remained, the temples stood, but the balance of power had shifted. Sumer became part of something larger, a legacy woven into the empires that would follow. And yet, even under foreign rule, the memory of Sumer's wars and heroes endured. In tablets and songs, the tales of battles fought for justice, land, and honor lived on. They were not just stories of blood and stone, but of identity, of survival, of a people who believed that even in conflict, they were serving something eternal. With the rise of Sargon of Akkad, around 2334 BCE, a new chapter unfolded in the long history of Sumer. The independent cities of the south, each with their own gods and kings, had flourished for centuries, competing, allying, and warring in cycles. But Sargon envisioned something greater, a unified land, one rule, one throne, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. And in pursuit of that vision, he reshaped the destiny of Sumer forever. Sargon's origins were steeped in legend. It is said that he was born to humble parents, placed in a basket of reeds, and set adrift on a river echoes of a myth that would later appear in other cultures. Raised in the city of Kish, he eventually rose to power, leading a professional army unlike anything Sumer had seen. With discipline, strategy, and the blessing of the goddess Inanna, by another name, he began his campaign of conquest. City after city fell before him. He defeated Lugalzagesi of Umma, who had briefly unified Sumer under his own rule. He marched on Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur, not destroying them, but incorporating them into a vast new administrative system. Temples were respected, local rulers often kept in place, but all power ultimately flowed to Akkad, Sargon's capital, and the center of a new imperial world. The Sumerians did not vanish under Akkadian rule. Their language continued to be used in temples and literature, even as Akkadian, written with the same cuneiform script, became the language of administration and daily life. The old gods were still worshipped, their temples maintained, their rituals performed. But the political map had changed. The age of the city-state was fading, and the age of empires had begun. Sargon's empire stretched farther than any before it. He claimed dominion from the lower sea Persian Gulf to the upper sea, likely the Mediterranean. He placed trusted officials, often family members, in charge of key regions. He established a postal system, standardized weights and measures, and expanded trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with Iran, Anatolia, and the Levant. The influence of Sumer now reached far beyond its floodplains, carried by merchants, soldiers, and scribes. His reign was not without resistance. Revolts flared up in various cities, but Sargon suppressed them with swift and often harsh responses. He ruled for over 50 years, and upon his death, his descendants continued the dynasty. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, would take the empire to even greater heights and further transformation. Naram-Sin declared himself not just king, but a god. He was the first Mesopotamian ruler to be deified in his own lifetime, wearing the horned crown of the gods in statues and inscriptions. His famous victory stele shows him towering over his enemies, climbing a mountain, followed by soldiers, with celestial symbols above him. This image marks a turning point not just in art, but in ideology. The king was no longer just a servant of the gods. He was one of them. Under Naram-Sin, the empire expanded and prospered, but it also grew brittle. The farther its borders stretched, the more difficult they became to defend. Rebellions became more frequent. Distant lands could not be held with faith alone, and nature too played its part. A series of droughts, possibly linked to larger climate shifts, began to strain the heartland. Agricultural output declined. Famine spread. The balance of the gods appeared broken. The Gutians, a group from the Zagros Mountains, took advantage of this weakness. They invaded from the east, toppling cities, disrupting trade, and plunging the region into what the Sumerians later called a dark time. The Akkadian Empire collapsed, and with it, the unity that Sargon had forged. Chaos followed, but it was not the end. From the ruins, the Sumerians rose again. In the city of Ur, a new dynasty would emerge, Ur III, often called the Sumerian Renaissance. The kings of this era reclaimed Sumerian identity, revived language and literature, and built monuments to rival those of earlier times. They reorganized bureaucracy, enforced legal codes, and reaffirmed devotion to the ancient gods. But even this revival carried the mark of what came before. The lessons of empire, its power, and its fragility remained etched in the minds of rulers and scribes. The Akkadian legacy was not erased. It was integrated. The two cultures had become one in many ways, Akkadian and Sumerian, north and south, myth and memory. The time of Sargon and Naram-Sin passed into legend. They were remembered in poems and curses, revered as giants and blamed for hubris. But above all, they were remembered. Their names, carved into clay, became chapters in the long, unfolding epic of Mesopotamia. The land remembered what it had seen, its glories, its tyrants, its storms and silences, and it whispered those memories to the future, tablet by tablet, city by city, breath by breath. In the wake of Akkad's collapse and the chaos wrought by the Gutians, the cities of Sumer did not disappear into silence. From the shadows of disorder, a light began to glow again, a revival of art, law, language, and ritual that would come to be known as the Sumerian Renaissance. At its heart stood the city of Ur, once again rising with purpose, crowned by a new dynasty that sought not only to restore what was lost, but to surpass it. The kings of Ur III, especially Ur-Nammu and Shulgiver, visionaries, organizers, and builders, they reclaimed the old language, the old customs, and revived the ancient temples with fresh stone and prayer. Their reigns, beginning around 2100 BCE, marked a period of remarkable political cohesion, economic planning, and cultural expression. Though their empire was smaller than Sargon's, it was more stable, deeply rooted in the soil of Sumer itself. Ur-Nammu, founder of the dynasty, is most famous for his law code Dune, of the oldest surviving examples of written legal tradition. Though it predates Hammurabi's more famous code by centuries, it follows the same basic format. If this happens, then that must follow. But Ur-Nammu's laws emphasize fairness, social stability, and the role of the king as a just and benevolent guardian of his people. The punishments are often monetary, and his tone is less harsh than what would follow in later eras. He also undertook massive construction projects. The great ziggurat of Ur, built under his rule, still stands today as a testament to his ambition and faith. Layer upon layer of mud brick, faced with baked stone, it once rose in stepped majesty over the flatlands, its summit touching the sky. Not just a place of worship, it was the spiritual and political axis of the city. the meeting point of earth and heaven, of ruler and god. After Ur-Nammu's death, his son Shulgi assumed the throne and ruled for nearly half a century. Shulgi was more than a king. He was a reformer, a poet, and a man who claimed to be divine. He boasted of his ability to write, to fight, to debate, to sing hymns. He reorganized the state, established an extensive road system, standardized measurements, and created a centralized bureaucracy that stretched from temple granaries to the distant outposts of the empire. Under Shulgi, Sumerian culture experienced one of its brightest flowerings. Literature was copied and refined. Schools flourished. Temple rituals became more elaborate. The Sumerian language, which had begun to fade under Akkadian rule, was now preserved and celebrated in both liturgy and law. Shulgi's hymns to himself, preserved in long poetic compositions, blend humility and pretty an image of a king both servant to the gods and godlike in his own right. The state he governed was a complex machine. Provinces were divided and overseen by appointed governors who reported directly to the king. Laborers worked land assigned to temples or palaces, and their rations measured in grain, beer, and oil were recorded on tablets by an ever-watchful bureaucracy. Nothing escaped the scribes' attention. They recorded births and deaths, taxes and penalties, construction projects, and temple offerings. These records, buried by time, are now windows into a world more organized than many imagined possible for such an early age. But power, even when wrapped in ritual and stone, is always fleeting. After Shulgi, the dynasty continued for several generations, but slowly signs of strain appeared. External pressures grew. Migratory groups like the Amorites began to press in from the west, and rival cities to the north grew restless. Internally, the weight of the administrative system may have become too great, too rigid. Grain failures, overtaxation, and corruption weakened the foundations. By the end of the 20th century BCE, the Elamites, from the mountains to the east, descended upon Ur. The last king, Ibbi-Sin, watched helplessly as the empire unraveled. Cities declared independence. The bureaucracy collapsed. The ziggurat of Ur, once bathed in golden light, stood surrounded by silence and broken walls. And yet, even in this fall, the people remembered. They sang laments not only for their city, but for a world they believed had been just, ordered, and blessed. These laments are among the most haunting texts in all of ancient literature. The lament for Ur mourns the temple's abandonment, the goddess's departure, the emptiness of streets once full of joy. It is not just a cry of loss. It is an act of memory, a ritual of dignity and defeat. Through words, they preserved what war and fire could not. Through song, they kept alive the soul of Sumer. And so, the Sumerian Renaissance passed, but not into oblivion. Its echoes were carried forward by those who followed. The Babylonians inherited their script, their stories, their gods. The Assyrians shaped their empires on Sumer's blueprint, and across millennia, in forgotten clay and whispered myth, the voices of Ur-3 still live, quiet, solemn, and enduring. When the cities of Sumer fell, they did not vanish in silence. In the ashes of their temples and the emptiness of their courtyards, the Sumerians left behind something extraordinary, something deeply human. They wrote songs of sorrow. These were the city laments, a unique genre of poetic compositions that mourned not just physical destruction, but the loss of divine favor, the breaking of sacred order, and the collapse of all that gave life meaning. One of the most haunting of these is the Lament for Ur, composed after the fall of the great city to Elamite invaders. It opens not with anger, but with grief. The city's goddess, Inanna's consort Ningal, weeps as she watches her temple burn, powerless to stop the ruin. Her cries become the voice of the people, of the priests, of the very bricks and stones that once held the divine presence. The lament speaks not only to historical loss, but to spiritual exile the gods have left, and the world is no longer whole. These were days of sorrow, it says, days when the storm raged, days when the house of the gods was torn apart. The language is vivid, but solemn. These laments do not glorify the conqueror or seek revenge. Instead, they offer memory. They preserve what was, acknowledge what is, and leave space for what might come again. In doing so, they fulfill a sacred purpose, to give voice to suffering in a way that dignifies it. The laments follow a ritual structure. They often begin by addressing the fallen city as if it were a living being. O Ur, city of the great gods, your people are scattered, your treasures spilled in the dust. The voice of the poet then moves through the temple halls, naming sacred objects, recalling rituals now gone, calling out to deities who have departed. There is rhythm, repetition, and an aching beauty to the way these songs unfold. What makes the lament so remarkable is how personal they are. Though they were likely composed by temple scribes and recited during formal ceremonies, they do not speak with the detached voice of official history. They grieve like a mother, like a child, like a priest who has lost his God. They cry not only for the city, but for the people, their hunger, their displacement, their broken homes. The laments carry the emotions of a whole society in collapse. There are laments for Ur, for Eridu, for Nippur, and for Sumer itself. Each one follows a similar arc: prosperity, abandonment, ruin, but each is rooted in the specific memory of a place. The ziggurats, the shrines, the city gates, all are remembered, not as symbols, but as beloved parts of life. The laments preserve the names of gods, kings, and temples that might otherwise have been lost. They are, in a way, Sumer's final great act of writing. They also reflect the Sumerian view of fate. The fall of a city was not seen merely as a result of political failure or military weakness. It was believed to be the will of the gods. When a city was destroyed, the people did not curse their enemies. They asked why their gods had turned away. Had they failed in their duties? Had pride grown too great? The laments wrestled with this silence, with the absence of divine guidance in a world now fractured. But even in sorrow, there is faith. Some laments end with hopia prayer that the gods will one day return, that the temples will be rebuilt, that the city will rise again. These closing verses are soft and tentative, but they carry the strength of belief. They show a people who, despite all, refused to forget who they were and what their world had been. The laments are not just historical artifacts. They are among the oldest expressions of collective mourning in human literature. They remind us that loss, though deeply personal, is also communal. That memory, when carried together, can become sacred, and that in naming grief, we begin to understand it. Though the cities fell, though the ziggurats crumbled, and the gods walked no more among their people, the songs endured. Buried in clay, preserved by fire, they waited to be read again. And when they are, the cities rise once more, not in stone, but in voice, soft, solemn, and eternal. Though the last of the Sumerian kings vanished from history nearly 4,000 years ago, their presence has never truly faded. Beneath the dust of the Mesopotamian plain, in the quiet halls of museums, and in the script carved into brittle clay, the world of Sumer continues to whisper. It whispers not only of temples and gods, but of the beginnings of everything that would follow. For in their cities, the Sumerians did not just live, they invented civilization. Their legacy begins with writing the great breakthrough that turned fleeting speech into permanent record. From pictographs scratched into clay to the complex system of cuneiform, the Sumerians created a way to store knowledge across generations. With it came literature, law, mathematics, history, and myth. Through writing, they froze time, allowing thoughts to leap across centuries. Their scribes were not just recorders, but curators of memory. They gave us the wheel not just for transportation, but for pottery, enabling the mass production of storage vessels. They organized labor and trade, created early forms of accounting, and divided time into hours and minutes using their base 60 numerical system. Their observations of the stars laid the groundwork for astronomy. They built canals to tame rivers, constructed ziggurats that reached for the heavens, and measured land with geometry and rules of proportion. The Sumerians pioneered urban life. Their cities were planned, their streets structured, their homes often centered around courtyards. They invented the concept of centralized administration, with bureaucracies that tracked harvests, work crews, taxes, and temple offerings. Their temples served not only religious functions, but economic ones, owning land, employing workers, and managing food stores. Their laws brought justice into the public sphere. Codes like that of Ur-Nammu laid the foundation for later legal traditions. These early codes emphasized order, fairness, and reparation. They showed that society was bound not by force alone, but by shared values, recorded and enforced. Their myths, too, continue to echo. The Epic of Gilgamesh, first written in Sumerian and refined through the ages, remains one of humanity's oldest literary works. It tells of friendship, grief, pride, and the search for immortality. It asks questions that are still asked today. What does it mean to be human? How do we face death? What gives life meaning? Even the story of the Great Flood, first found in the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, flowed into later traditions, Babylonian, Hebrew, and beyond. In these echoes, we find the shape of cultural continuity. Sumerian gods evolved, merged, and reappeared under new names in new lands. Inanna became Ishtar, Utu became Shamash, Enki became Ea. The structure of their pantheon, their myths, their rituals all became templates for those who followed. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Sumerians were not eternal. Their language faded. Their cities fell. Their names were buried. But the ideas they set in motion could not be contained. They became part of the great human inheritance. Every time we write a law, mark a calendar, divide an hour, or tell a story of gods and heroes, we are, in some distant way, speaking the language of Sumer. Their legacy is not only found in achievements, but in their humanity. In their hymns and laments, they show us joy, sorrow, doubt, and hope. They grieved their losses. They honored their ancestors. They reached for the divine, not with certainty, but with awe. Their civilization was not flawless. It was full of conflict, inequality, and struggle. But it was real, alive, and enduring. The rediscovery of Sumer in the 19th and 20th centuries through archaeology and the patient decoding of cuneiform revealed not just forgotten history, but the very roots of civilization. Scholars, brushing sand from broken tablets, found the voices of the first cities, and in doing so, they reminded the world that long before Greece and Rome, long before the pyramids and the prophets, there were people who looked at the stars, asked why, and wrote the answer in clay. The Sumerians are not remembered because they lasted, but because they began. They turned the first page of humanity's long, unfolding story. And though time wore down their bricks and silenced their courts, their story continues. Not in stone alone, but in every quiet moment when a question is asked, a line is written, or a memory is preserved. For millennia, the story of Sumer lay buried, quite literally, beneath the sands and sediments of southern Iraq. Its cities were lost, its language unknown, and its people remembered only dimly, if at all, in scattered myths and biblical references. No one knew that beneath the ruined mounds called tells, entire civilizations lay waiting. It would take patient explorers, scholars, and archaeologists to awaken the voice of the first civilization from its deep and silent sleep. The rediscovery of Sumer began in the 19th century, during a time of growing fascination with the ancient Near East. European travelers and scholars, drawn by curiosity and imperial ambition, ventured into Mesopotamia. They climbed the wind-swept ruins, spoke with local communities, and collected strange bricks covered in unfamiliar markings. These marks, inscribed in clay, would prove to be the cuneiform script, the written language of Sumer and its successors. In 1843, Paul-Émile Botta, a French consul stationed in Mosul, began excavations at a mound near Khorsabad. What he found was not Sumerian, but Assyriana later civilization that had inherited Sumer's traditions. Still, it sparked interest. Shortly after, Austen Henry Layard began exploring the site of Nineveh and uncovered the Great Library of Ashurbanipal. Within this library were thousands of cuneiform tablets, including fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh and much older texts that hinted at an even more ancient culture. The decipherment of cuneiform was one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th century. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson, working with trilingual inscriptions such as the Behistun inscription in Iran, began to crack the code. Bit by bit, signs were identified, sounds were matched, and words began to emerge. With each breakthrough, more of the ancient world came into view, not just names and dates, but voices, prayers, laws, and poems. As excavations continued in southern Iraq, archaeologists uncovered the cities of Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and others. At first, these were believed to be Akkadian or Babylonian in origin. But then came a surprise text written in a language that did not match Akkadian, a language that stood alone with no known relatives. This was Sumerian, and its discovery shifted everything. It revealed a civilization that had existed before Babylon, before the Assyrians, a culture that had laid the very groundwork of all that followed. Perhaps the most iconic excavation was that of led by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 30s. His team uncovered the royal cemetery of where Queen Puabi and others had been laid to rest with gold, jewels, instruments, and attendants. These finds captivated the world, not only for their beauty, but for what they said about Sumerian society, ritual, and belief. The richness of these tombs suggested a civilization both sophisticated and deeply spiritual. Tablets found in these digs numbered in the tens of thousands. They included myths, economic records, legal codes, medical texts, hymns, and proverbs. Many were broken, some barely readable, but together they formed a vast mosaic of human experience. Translators worked tirelessly, often over decades, to piece together stories from fragments the size of a hand. Each tablet was a puzzle, each line a door opening into a forgotten world. And slowly, the world of Sumer came into focus. Scholars began to reconstruct its history, its dynasties, its literature. They pieced together the Sumerian king list, charted trade routes, mapped temple networks. They uncovered not just facts, but personalities: Ur-Nammu, the lawgiver; Shulgi, the poet-king; Enheduanna, the priestess-poet. The clay had preserved their lives with astonishing fidelity. The rediscovery of Sumer not only filled a gap in history, it redefined the origins of civilization itself. No longer was Egypt seen as the sole cradle of order and writing. Now, in the land between the rivers, another origin point was recognized. A culture that had written before the pyramids were built, that had created cities while Europe remained in prehistory. Sumer became the first known chapter of the human story. And yet, even now, much remains hidden. Thousands of tablets still lie untranslated. Sites remain unexplored, endangered by erosion, war, and looting. Each new discovery has the potential to reshape our understanding once more. The story of Sumer is not finished, it continues. In labs, in universities, in silent desert mounds that still hold secrets. In rediscovering Sumer, we did more than recover a lost civilization. We heard again the first voice of humanity, writing in clay, building with care, praying with hope. We were reminded that beneath the surface of time, the past is never truly lost, only waiting. The Sumerians did not carve their legacy into monuments alone. They etched it into clay. And in doing so, they gave humanity a way to speak across the silence of millennia. Their language, Sumerian, was unlike any other, a linguistic isolate. It bore no known relatives, and yet it became the foundation for an entire written tradition that would carry the thoughts, laws, hopes, and fears of civilizations to come. The Sumerians began with simple marks. At first, their writing was pictographic symbols representing objects, animals, and quantities, pressed or scratched into damp clay tablets. These early tablets, often administrative in nature, tracked the movement of grain, livestock, and labor. But as their society grew more complex, so too did their script. The pictographs gradually evolved into abstract symbols, more streamlined, more stylized, easier to repeat. Eventually, these symbols took on phonetic value, representing sounds, not just things. This was the true birth of cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped impressions made by the stylus. The stylus itself was usually fashioned from a reed, cut at an angle to form a triangular tip. With this simple tool, the scribes transformed soft clay into a surface for thought, one that could be dried in the sun or baked in kilns to last forever. Learning to write Sumerian was a long and difficult process. Young scribes trained in special schools called Eduba tablet houses. There, they copied long lists of words, proverbs, and model texts day after day until their hands grew strong and their minds could recall thousands of signs. Their early exercises survive to this day, practiced tablets with mistakes, corrections, and doodles, still bearing the breath of effort from 4,000 years ago. The content of Sumerian writing was vast. There were legal codes, treaties, and contracts. There were temple inventories, hymns, and tax records. There were spells, proverbs, and medical instructions. Myths and epics were carefully composed and recopied. The scribes did not merely document, they curated, interpreted, and transmitted. They preserved a worldview, a cosmology, and a living history. Cuneiform tablets varied in size. Some were no larger than a human palm, used for receipts and daily notes. Others were broad and heavy, designed for official archives or libraries. Particularly sacred or important inscriptions were also written onto stone steles, brick stamps, and even cylinder sealstony carved objects that could be rolled across clay to leave behind names, titles, and sacred images. Despite their seeming permanence, the clay tablets were fragile. Many were shattered over time by accident, by conquest, or by nature. Yet paradoxically, it was this fragility that helped them endure. Fires that might have destroyed papyrus or parchment instead baked the clay, preserving it. In the ruins of palaces and temples, beneath the collapsed roofs of scribal chambers, tablets lay waiting, sometimes perfectly intact, their writing sharp and clear as the day it was pressed. The Sumerian language itself eventually ceased to be spoken, replaced by Akkadian in daily life. But it remained in use as a scholarly and religious language for centuries, more similar to the role of Latin in medieval Europe. Priests and scribes continued to study and copy Sumerian texts long after the last native speaker had fallen silent. In this way, the language lived on not in conversation, but in careful repetition. When scholars in the modern era finally deciphered cuneiform, Sumerian was one of the last languages to reveal its voice. Unlike Akkadian, it had no known relatives to aid the process. Yet through patient study of bilingual texts and repetition exercises from scribal schools, linguists began to unlock its patterns. Line by line, the words of the first poets and lawgivers came to life again. Today, thousands of Sumerian tablets sit in museums and collections around the world. Many have been translated. Many more remain silent, awaiting the eye of a scholar, the moment of recognition. Each one is a time capsule, a direct link to a world that once buzzed with prayer and policy, love and law, doubt and dream. The Sumerians trusted clay to hold their thoughts, and they were right. Though their cities crumbled, though empires rose and fell above their buried libraries, their words endured, not loud, but steady, not fleeting, but eternal. Pressed by human hands, dried in sun and fire, and carried by memory into a future they could never have imagined. Beneath the grandeur of ziggurats, beyond the epic tales of kings and gods, there flowed a quieter current in Sumerian culture, the current of everyday wisdom. It did not shout, but whispered, passed from teacher to student, parent to child, scribe to apprentice. It lived in proverbs, parables, and instruction short, sharp, earthy expressions that carried the distilled experience of generations. These sayings, etched into clay, reveal the soul of a people not just concerned with the cosmos, but with how to live well among others. Sumerian proverbs are among the oldest known examples of folk wisdom. They are brief, rhythmic, and often poetic. Some are humorous, others are practical. A few are deeply philosophical. Many feel surprisingly familiar, as though the concerns of ancient Sumerians were not so different from our own. They spoke of fairness, friendship, caution, hard work, trust, and the fickle nature of fate. Consider the proverb, "A man who does not know anything, even if he has a noble face, is still a fool." It's a simple reminder that status means nothing without wisdom. Or, he who has silver is happy, he who has grain is even happier. A subtle nod to the real value of sustenance over luxury in a land dependent on agriculture. And another, you go and carry your strong friend. One day, he will carry you. A lesson in reciprocity. the mutual dependency that builds strong communities. These proverbs were not simply oral sayings, they were recorded, copied, and studied in scribal schools. Collections of them survive on clay tablets, sometimes listed alphabetically, sometimes thematically. They served as moral lessons, intellectual exercises, and mirrors for daily life. Through them, the Sumerians passed down not just facts, but the emotional and ethical shape of their world. There were also parables and fable-short narratives, using animals or everyday situations to express deeper truths. In one, a tree and a reed argue over which is stronger. The tree boasts of its height and strength. But when a storm comes, the reed bends and survives, while the tree is broken. It's a lesson about humility and resilience, one echoed in many later traditions across the world. The Sumerians also composed dialogues and debates, often between personified elements of the natural world. In the debate between summer and winter, the two seasons argue before the gods about which is more valuable. Each presents their case: summer with its harvest, winter with its rest and renewal. At the end, the gods render a verdict. But the point is not the outcome, it's the process, the exploration of perspective, the celebration of nature's balance. One particularly rich tradition was the genre of instructions, didactic texts in which a father advises his son. These often blend personal concern with broader cultural values. In the Instructions of Uruk, one of the earliest known, we read advice like, "Do not pass judgment when you drink beer. Do not answer with hostility to your elders. Do not move the boundary stone of a field." Each line captures a small piece of how the Sumerians envisioned a good life rooted in respect, restraint, and responsibility. They knew that cities could only stand when individuals lived with care and awareness. In their own way, these texts functioned like early ethical handbooks, blueprints for surviving not just physically, but socially. Their wisdom extended to humor and irony. One proverb jokes, "You can have a temple, but if you don't have a latrine, you still have a problem." A reminder that the sacred and the mundane coexist, and that even the grandest life needs basic foundations. In all this, we see a civilization deeply engaged with the human condition. They were not content to worship the stars or honor kings. They wanted to understand how to navigate the complex maze of daily life. Their proverbs and sayings were tools, gentle guides for those moving through the crowded markets, noisy workshops, and quiet homes of their cities. Today, these fragments of wisdom are still readable, still relevant. They speak of patience, balance, awareness, and humility. They remind us that even in the oldest of civilizations, the human heart beat with the same questions. How do we live? How do we treat others? What matters most? The Sumerians left behind more than bricks and tablets. They left behind a voice, a soft, enduring voice that does not command, but suggests, does not shout, but lasts. In these modest sayings, civilization itself found its conscience. To live in Sumer was to live within a sacred structure, not only among bricks and canals, but beneath a vast and ordered cosmos. The Sumerians saw the world not as a collection of random events, but as an interconnected whole, where gods, nature, and humanity each had a role to play. Their cosmology was not a system of distant stars, but a living map shaped by myth, ritual, and the rhythms of the rivers that cradled their cities. At the highest level of this cosmic structure was An, the sky, both a god and a place, infinite and quiet, where fate was written and the divine order declared. Beneath him was Ki, the earth, the nourishing ground of life, ruled and shaped by the gods and worked by humankind. Between the two moved Enlil, the air, the breath, the wind, the word that carried command from heaven to earth. These three, An, Ki, and Enlil, formed the vertical axis of the world. The horizontal plane, the realm of daily life, was a blend of natural cycles and divine presence. Rivers were not simply water. They were gifts from the gods, flowing with both blessing and danger. The land, fertile only through careful labor and irrigation, was considered a place of both bounty and testing. The sun, the moon, the stars, all were divine entities with duties and personalities. Utu the sun watched over justice, Inanna the moon governed time, and the stars marked the passing of fate. But beneath it all, deeper than the rivers, below the roots of the ziggurats, lay Kur, the underworld. This was the land of the dead, ruled by Ereshkigal, queen of the shadows. It was not a place of punishment or reward, but of stillness. Souls went there regardless of how they had lived. It was dusty, dark, and dry, a place where nothing grew and no voice rose loudly. Yet it was part of the balance, just as necessary as the sky above. The Sumerians imagined the journey to Kur as a descent through 7 gates. At each gate, something was left behind: possessions, power, identity, until the soul arrived, bare and quiet, before Ereshkigal's throne. The most famous telling of this journey appears in the myth of Inanna's descent. The goddess of love and war chooses to visit her sister in the underworld, and in doing so, she dies, is hung on a hook, and is only restored through divine intervention. This myth was more than a story. It was a model of renewal, a reminder that life flows through death, and death through life. The cosmic structure also extended into architecture. Temples were not merely houses of gods, they were microcosms. The ziggurat, with its terraced levels, represented the cosmic mountain, the meeting point of earth and heaven. Rituals performed within its chambers were believed to mirror the divine order. When a priest or priestess offered incense, recited hymns, or poured libations, they were participating in a cosmic drama, maintaining the fabric of the world. Time itself was sacred, flowing in circles rather than lines. The calendar was lunar, tied to the phases of Inanna, the moon god. Each month bore rituals, fasts, and festivals aligned with agricultural cycles and mythological events. The New Year festival, Akitu, was a reenactment of creation and renewal. Kings were reaffirmed, gods were honored, and chaos was ritually dismissed, allowing order to be reborn once more. Even dreams were part of the cosmos. They were messages from the divine realm, symbols sent through the veil. Temples often had special chambers where priests interpreted dreams, and entire tablets were filled with lists of dream omens. If one dreamed of a lion, it meant danger. If one dreamed of walking in a garden, it foretold abundance. The line between waking and sleeping, between the seen and unseen, was thin and easily crossed. The Sumerians didn't separate science from spirituality. Observing the stars was an act of devotion. Calculating the flood cycles of the rivers was a way to understand the gods' moods. Even illness was a disruption of cosmic harmony, to be corrected not only with herbs, but with prayer and purification. The entire world was alive, woven with meaning. This cosmology did not demand certainty. It invited participation. The Sumerians did not claim to control the universe, only to understand their place within it. They accepted mystery, worked within cycles, and honored the powers that move through stone and star alike. In every offering, every prayer, every alignment of brick and measure, they were speaking to the cosmos. And though their voices have long faded from the air, their understanding remains a quiet map drawn in myth, ritual, and clay, guiding us still through the great rhythm of sky, earth, and the world beneath. Amid the dust and stone of their cities, the Sumerians found time to shape beauty, not only for the gods, but for themselves. Their art was not ornamental for its own sake, it was woven into the life of their temples, palaces, and homes. It expressed devotion, celebrated power, marked identity, and captured the stillness of a moment in a world shaped by time and tide. Sumerian art, like their language and architecture, followed order, proportion, and purpose, yet within it, emotions stirred. Much of what survives today comes from their temples and burial sites places, where objects were preserved with intention. Statuary was among the most striking of their artistic forms. Carved from limestone, alabaster, or diorite, many statues depict worshippers with wide, staring eyes, hands clasped in prayer, bodies rigid and humble. These figures were meant not just as representations, but as stand-ins. They were left in temples to perpetually offer devotion to the gods, even when the worshipper had gone. The eyes, exaggerated and round, symbolize eternal vigilance, a soul that never ceases its watch, always gazing toward the divine. Some statues bear inscriptions, names, prayers, dedications linking them to specific people and purposes. These are not anonymous forms. They are portraits of piety. Royal art, by contrast, carries the weight of power. The famous Stele of the Vultures shows King Enheduanna of Lagash leading his soldiers into battle, trampling enemies underfoot. But even here, divine figures hover above the Freyningirsu. The god of war holds enemies in a net like fish. The composition is narrative and symbolic, blending history with mythology. The king is shown as a warrior, but also as a servant of the gods. Another example is the Standard of a richly decorated box-like object found in the royal cemetery of One side shows scenes of war chariots, prisoners, kings standing in victory. The other side shows peace banquets, musicians, servants bringing food and drink. The dual imagery speaks of balance, the duties of a king in both battle and abundance. The figures are rendered in lapis lazuli, shell, and red limestone, laid into a wooden frame with exquisite care. Sumerian craftsmanship extended to smaller objects, jewelry, cylinder seals, pottery, tools. Their jewelry, found in the tombs of includes elaborate headdresses, necklaces, and earrings made from gold, silver, and semi-precious stones. These were not merely decorative. They carried symbolic meaning, denoting rank, invoking divine protection, and celebrating the abundance of the land. Cylinder seals were among the most personal forms of art. These tiny carved stones were worn on the body and used to roll impressions onto clay tablets. Each seal bore intricate scenes, gods, animals, rituals, or abstract design, serving as both a signature and a charm. In a world without paper or ink, the seal was a portable identity, a fusion of image and message. Wall carvings and temple reliefs also played a role in public and sacred life. Though much has been lost, fragments show detailed scenes of offerings, processions, and divine ceremonies. These were didactic, as well as decorative, visual texts that taught the viewer their place in the cosmos, the structure of society, and the roles of gods and kings. Musical instruments, such as the lyres found in Queen Puabi's tomb, remind us that sound, too, was an art. These instruments were decorated with golden bullheads, inlaid eyes, and geometric patterns. They were used in ritual and entertainment, their tones rising beneath moonlit skies or echoing through temple courtyards during ceremonies. Color was present, though faded now. The Sumerians painted their statues, walls, and ceramics. They used natural dyes, reds from iron oxide, blues from lapis, whites from gypsum. These colors were applied with purpose: red for power, blue for divinity, white for purity. Art was never without meaning. It always spoke to something deeper, something unseen. Perhaps what is most striking about Sumerian art is its restraint. It avoids excess, favoring balance and clarity. Even in its most ornate expressions, there is order and adherence to form that reflects the Sumerian belief in a structured cosmos. And yet, within that structure, there is Sulan unmistakable tenderness in the curve of a musician's hand, a quiet intensity in the gaze of a praying figure. Their art, like their civilization, does not overwhelm with size or spectacle. It invites stillness, reflection, a sense of standing not outside time, but within its flow. And though the hands that shaped it have long turned to dust, their vision remains, etched in gold, pressed in clay, echoing softly through museum halls and desert winds alike. Beneath the towering ziggurats and beside the sacred temples, everyday life in Sumer moved quietly, shaped by sun, river, and custom. For the vast majority of people, life was not lived in palaces or scriptoriums, but in modest homes of mud brick, surrounded by gardens, ovens, livestock, and family. And while the kings wrote laws and priests performed rituals, it was the hands of farmers, artisans, traders, and laborers that kept the great cities of Sumer alive. The Sumerians rose early, with the light of Ututh's sun god marking the start of another day. In rural areas, farmers walked to their fields before the heat became too strong. They worked with wooden plows, pulled by oxen, cutting furrows through the soil irrigated by the canals they themselves maintained. Barley was the primary crop, along with dates, onions, garlic, leeks, and flax. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers gave life to the fields, but managing their waters required constant labor and vigilance. In the cities, craftsmen began their work as smoke curled from rooftops. Potters shaped vessels on wheels, bakers filled ovens with flatbread, metalworkers hammered copper into tools and ornaments. In weaving rooms, women and men turned flax into thread and cloth, producing garments dyed with natural color-smuted reds, browns, and soft blues. Each craft was a tradition, passed from parent to child, often within the same neighborhood for generations. The home was the center of Sumerian family life. Houses were built close together, often sharing walls, with flat roofs used for drying crops, sleeping during hot nights, or even gathering socially. Rooms were arranged around open courtyards that let in air and light. Inside, walls were plastered and whitewashed. Mats and low furniture made spaces functional and welcoming. Simple altars honored household gods and ancestors. Families were typically extended grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all under one roof or nearby. Children were taught by example, mimicking the work of their elders from a young age. Boys might join their fathers in the fields or workshops. Girls learned weaving, cooking, and song. For those destined to become scribes, the path was longer and more formal, beginning with memorization, followed by years of copying and learning complex signs. Marriage was a practical and social contract. Arranged by families, It often came with a dowry and formal agreements recorded by scribes. Ceremonies were simple, sealed with feasts and offerings. Love, though not always the foundation of marriage, is still visible in Sumerian poetry songs and verses that celebrate beauty, longing, and partnership. Some of these poems would later inspire the famous biblical Song of Songs, their imagery rooted in gardens and stars. Food in Sumer was seasonal and tied to the rhythms of agriculture. Meals centered around barley bread, onions, dates, lentils, and dairy. Meat was less common, usually reserved for festivals or wealthier households. Beer, brewed from fermented barley, was the staple drink, served in wide-mouthed jars with long straws. It was both nourishment and ritual, enjoyed in homes, temples, and celebrations alike. Markets were lively and essential. Traders and farmers brought goods from the countryside into the city's fresh produce, fish from the rivers, baskets, leather goods, and textiles. There were no coins. Trade relied on silver by weight or barter for everyday exchanges. Deals were made with handshakes and recorded with seals. The market wasn't just an economic hub, it was where news spread, relationships formed, and culture circulated. The week had no fixed 7-day structure as we know it, but time was measured by lunar cycles, agricultural tasks, and temple festivals. Each month began with the new moon, and major temples organized feasts, rituals, and rest days. Music, dancing, and games like dice and board games filled the quiet hours between labor and sleep. Children played with toys made of clay and wood. Small carts, animals, and figurines carved with simple care. Illness and health were treated with both herbal remedies and ritual incantations. Healers combined plant knowledge with prayers to gods like Gula, goddess of healing. Amulets were worn to ward off evil spirits. Dreams were interpreted as messages from the divine or warnings from the underworld. When death came, the body was buried with care, and offerings were made to help the soul rest peacefully in Kur, the land below. Though life was fragile and hard, the Sumerians found meaning in their rituals, in their daily rhythms, and in their stories. They lived with the knowledge that they were part of something larger, a city, a cosmos, a history, and in every task, from baking to building, they honored the sacred balance of the world. Their lives may seem distant now, but in the brush of clay on bread, the quiet murmur of a child's question, the worn grooves of a craftsman's tools, there remains a deep and recognizable humanity. A civilization not only of innovation and record, but of ordinary people living, loving, working, and remembering. In the Sumerian world, time was not a line, but a cycle, woven with festivals, sacred days, and rituals that aligned the lives of people with the rhythms of the gods. The year was a living organism, a great turning wheel of seasons, moons, and divine moments. Each city had its own calendar, shaped by its patron deity and the needs of its community, but all shared the belief that to honor the gods in time was to maintain the harmony of the world. At the heart of these cycles were festivals days and nights filled with processions, music, offerings, and symbolic acts. These events were not simply celebrations. They were moments when the boundaries between human and divine were thinned, when gods were believed to walk among their people, accept their gifts, and renew their blessings. To miss a festival was to risk falling out of sync with the cosmos. The most important festival in many cities was the Akitu, celebrated at the beginning of the new year, during the spring barley harvest. It was a time of renewal, rebirth, and reaffirmation of divine order. The Akitu lasted several days, during which priests purified temples, kings underwent ritual humbling, and sacred statues were carried in elaborate processions through the city streets. Music echoed from rooftops. Offerings of fruit, bread, and incense filled the air. The gods were honored not in silence, but in joy and grandeur. One of the most symbolic parts of the Akitu was the ritual reenactment of the sacred marriage. In this rite, the king, representing the god Dumuzi, united with a high priestess playing the role of Inanna. This union was not physical alone, it was cosmic. Their act symbolized the fertilization of the land, the renewal of life, and the affirmation of kingship as divinely sanctioned. Through it, the people believed the gods would ensure a bountiful harvest and continued harmony. Other festivals marked key points in the lunar calendar. Each new moon began a new month and brought minor rituals and offerings. Full moons were seen as times of divine vision, when omens could be read more clearly and prayers might reach the heavens with greater strength. Eclipses were moments of danger, requiring urgent ceremonies to ward off misfortune or the wrath of celestial forces. Each deity also had their own special days. Nanna, the moon god, worshipped in was honored with night vigils and quiet rites. Inanna's festivals, by contrast, were loud, sensuous, and filled with ecstatic dance and music. Her followers played lyres and drums, sang hymns of longing and triumph, and processed through the streets with banners and flowers. Rituals to Enlil, the god of storm and order, were more solemn, marked by silence, prayer, and the reading of omens. Temples were the center of these celebrations. Before the crowd gathered, priests purified the sacred spaces with water and incense. Offerings were arranged with precise care. Statues of the gods were washed, dressed in fresh garments, adorned with jewelry, and brought forth to view the people. These statues were not symbols alone, they were thought to embody the living presence of the gods. To see the statue was to glimpse the divine. Outside the temples, the entire community participated. Children learned songs from elders, artisans crafted decorative items, and baked ceremonial breads shaped like animals or sacred symbols. Families visited relatives, shared food, and gave thanks. Even the poorest contributed what they could, for festivals were not just religious obligations, they were threads that held society together. The rituals also served a political purpose. During major festivals, the king was publicly reaffirmed in his role as intermediary between gods and people. In some rites, he underwent symbolic humiliation, stripped of regalia, struck lightly by a priest, made to confess his unworthiness before being reinstated and blessed. This drama reminded all that power came not from ambition, but from divine favor. Seasonal change was always sacred. Planting festivals in early spring invoked the aid of agricultural deities. Harvest festivals gave thanks for abundance and marked the closing of another cycle. In between, the turning of the year was filled with minor observances, cleansing days, remembrance rites, and the honoring of ancestors. The Sumerians believed that by marking these days, they kept the cosmos balanced. Each ritual was a renewal of the original creation, a reweaving of the divine pattern. Without them, chaos might return. The rivers might flood too high or fail to rise. The gods might grow silent. Life itself depended on attention, on memory, on rhythm, on the offering of devotion at the right time. Today, long after the cities have crumbled, the clay has cracked, and the drums have fallen silent, the festivals of Sumer still echo. They remind us that time is not only a measure of minutes and hours, but a sacred journey, one filled with pauses, with joy, with meaning. In every festival, the Sumerians danced not just for their gods, but for the order of the universe itself. Though the grand temples of Sumer rose high above the cities, filled with priests, rituals, and processions, religion was not confined to monumental spaces. It lived also within the humble walls of homes, in the flicker of oil lamps, in whispered prayers at dawn, and in the quiet arrangement of offerings on a household altar. For the people of Sumer, faith was both public and deeply personal, woven into daily life, unspoken but constant, as present as breath. In every home, from the smallest hut to the residence of a wealthy merchant or official, there existed a space for worship. This might be a niche in the wall, a corner shelf, or a small table where figurines stood a family's private shrine. These figures were not grand idols, but modest images of protective deities, ancestral spirits, or representations of the household's favored god or goddess. Clay figurines of Inanna, Nanna, Enki, or lesser-known guardian spirits were common, each carrying meaning passed down through generations. Worship at home was simple but sincere. Offerings of food, water, incense, or flowers were placed daily or during key moments: births, illnesses, marriages, or changes in season. Mothers might murmur prayers while grinding grain. Fathers might pour out a small libation before beginning work. Children were taught to show respect to the gods as naturally as they learned to speak. The sacred was never far. It filled the silence between footsteps. Protective charms and amulets were also a part of this quiet devotion. They were worn as jewelry, embedded in door frames, or tucked into corners of rooms. These objects often bore inscriptions or symbols meant to keep away evil spirits, illness, or misfortune. The most common materials were clay, shell, and soft stones, crafted not for beauty, but for their perceived spiritual power. Dreams, too, were sacred in the household. A troubling dream might be interpreted as a warning, a good one as a promise. Dream interpreters existed in temples, but many families relied on inherited knowledge or local wise women. Dreams were written down or retold in the morning light, and their meanings became part of a family's unspoken guidance. In the quiet hours of night, the divine often whispered most clearly. During sickness or hardship, families combined practical remedies with spiritual appeals. A healer might be called to recite an incantation, mix herbs, and burn incense. But the family too would kneel by the bedside, calling upon Gula, goddess of healing, or Ninurta, the warrior who cast out demons. Illness was never seen as a purely physical matter. It was a disturbance in the cosmic balance, a sign that something had gone awry. Healing meant restoring order. Birth was accompanied by ritual as well. Mothers prayed to Nin-Hersag, the great mother goddess, protector of life and fertility. Midwives performed quiet ceremonies to guard against misfortune. Newborns were washed, named, and blessed, sometimes with a tiny clay charm placed in their sleeping place. The first cries of a child were answered not only with joy, but with offerings to the unseen powers that had guided the soul into the world. Ancestral reverence was also central. The dead were not forgotten. They were part of the home. Many families buried loved ones beneath the floor of the house or in nearby courtyards. It was common to pour libations into small clay pipes leading to the graves. Offerings of water, beer, or oil meant to nourish the spirit. A neglected ancestor might become restless, bringing misfortune, but a well-honored one could bring protection and blessings. This ongoing relationship with the dead formed a living memory, a sense that the past walked beside the present. The Sumerians did not think of time as something lost, but something layered. The dead remained near, listening, watching, sometimes even speaking in dreams or omens. a name spoken aloud, a meal offered in silence. These were acts of faith as powerful as any temple hymn. Household religion was not a replacement for official temple worship. It was its reflection, its echo, its foundation. While kings prayed for cities and empires, families prayed for health, peace, and good harvests. While priests performed great rituals in sacred halls, mothers kindled lamps in quiet corners. Both were necessary. Both kept the world in motion. In this deeply personal spirituality, the Sumerians showed that the divine was not distant. It was here, in the steam rising from a clay pot, in the rhythm of work and rest, in the scent of crushed herbs and the warmth of a shared meal. Their gods were great and powerful, yes, but also close, attentive, and bound to the human heart. Their religion, so often seen through the lens of ziggurats and epics, truly lived in the gentle gestures of the home, in clay figurines worn smooth by generations of touch, in quiet prayers never written down, in offerings too small for record, but too sincere to forget. It was there, in those silent moments, that the oldest echoes of devotion still linger. Even the greatest civilizations, no matter how deeply rooted, must one day yield to time. The Sumerians, after more than 1,000 years of brilliance, resilience, and reinvention, slowly faded into history. Their cities grew quieter, their language softened into liturgy, their gods took new names, their kings lost their thrones, but they did not vanish all at once. The end of Sumer was not a fall, but a long, gentle twilight. The causes were many. Political fragmentation weakened central authority. Repeated invasions from outside peoples, most notably the Amorites from the west and Elamites from the east, disrupted trade, agriculture, and security. Climate change played its role too, with shifting river courses and extended periods of drought reducing the productivity of the land. Temples were harder to maintain, walls were harder to defend, and the unity once dreamed of by kings like Ur-Nammu began to slip away. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Akkadian had become the dominant spoken language in Mesopotamia. Sumerian, though still used in religious and scholarly texts, was no longer the tongue of the common people. Children learned it the way one might learn the words of sacred songs, not to speak, but to remember. The scribes preserved it diligently, treating it as a language of the gods, while everyday speech turned to the tongue of newcomers. Cities like Ur, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur still stood, but their power waned. New powers emerged from the north and west. The Amorites established Babylon, while the Assyrians rose in Ashur. These civilizations borrowed much from Sumer's writing, its myths, its laws, even its deities, but they gave them new form and new voice. In time, few remembered where these traditions had begun. The last known royal inscriptions written in Sumerian date to around 2000 BCE. But even after that, the language lingered in temples, in the hands of priests and scribes. For centuries more, students copied Sumerian texts on clay tablets in scribal schools, preserving them line by line. In this way, the memory of Sumer did not die with its people. It was curated, archived, and honored. The continuity is striking. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though recorded most famously in Akkadian, has deep Sumerian roots. The flood story, the themes of mortality and friendship, the search for meaning, all were first whispered in Sumer. The gods, too, survived. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea, Utu became Shamash. The temples changed hands, but the rituals bore familiar shapes. The torch passed on, but it still bore the Sumerian flame. And in that legacy, there is something profound, Civilizations rise and fall, but ideas endure. Structures crumble, but symbols remain. The Sumerians were the first to write, to build cities, to map the stars, to name justice. Their words, pressed into soft clay and baked by fire or accident, have lasted longer than any of their walls. They speak still, not in chants or shouts, but in the steady tone of survival. Their decline was not failure, it was transition. As the land between the rivers changed hands, the memory of what had come before sank beneath new layers. The tells those massive, layered mounds of earth grew higher with each generation, burying temples and homes alike. But underneath, the story remained, waiting for the winds of time and the hands of scholars to uncover it. Today, as archaeologists brush sand from tablets and translators breathe meaning into ancient lines, the voice of Sumer rises again, not as myth, but as memory. A memory not only of kings and gods, but of people who lived and loved, prayed and feared, dreamed and worked under the same stars we see today. The end of Sumer was not silence, it was a pause, a moment in the long conversation of civilization. And now, with every tablet deciphered, every statue unearthed, that conversation continues, echoing through time in the soft language of clay. Though the cities of Sumer eventually fell quiet and their language ceased to be spoken aloud, their spirit did not vanish. Like a river feeding distant lands, the ideas and institutions born in Sumer flowed onward, shaping the great civilizations that followed. Babylon, Assyria, Persia, and even far-off Greece would draw from the deep well the Sumerians had dug, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, carrying pieces of the world's first civilization into new ages. Nowhere is this continuity more evident than in Babylon. The Babylonian Empire, rising to prominence in the second millennium BCE, adopted and adapted nearly every aspect of Sumerian culture. The cuneiform script continued, evolving in form but preserving its essence. Sumerian myths were rewritten in Akkadian, their gods honored with new names, their hymns still sung in temple rituals. The Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation myth, echoes Sumerian cosmology Anu, Enlil and Ea, the Akkadian Enki, still playing their roles in the divine drama. Babylonian law, too, built upon Sumerian foundations. The Code of Hammurabi, so often celebrated as a milestone in legal history, bears striking resemblance to earlier Sumerian codes like that of Ur-Nammu. The format, the moral emphasis, the societal role show that Babylon was not creating law from scratch, but inheriting a legal and moral framework refined across centuries of Sumerian governance. Assyria, farther north, inherited Sumerian religious and administrative structures. Its great kings Ashurnasirpal, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib styled themselves as guardians of divine order, their legitimacy drawn from the same ideals first proclaimed in Eridu and Ur. They built ziggurats, copied Sumerian rituals, and filled libraries with texts that still bore traces of Sumer's first scribes. Even in later Persian and Hellenistic rule, echoes remained. The layout of cities, the use of archives, the importance of astrology, and the sacred role of kingship all bore the mark of Sumerian precedent. Though the script eventually gave way to alphabetic writing systems, and the language faded entirely from common use, the Sumerian way of seeing the world, ordered, cyclical, and infused with meaning, remained a deep current beneath the surface. In spiritual thought, too, Sumerian influence lingered. Concepts of divine justice, heavenly order, the underworld, and the moral responsibility of rulers all filtered into later religious systems. The idea of gods who walked among humans, who punished or blessed according to law and ritual, became central to Mesopotamian religion, and, eventually, elements of those beliefs found echoes in the sacred texts of later cultures. Even the very structure of time, your 60-minute hours, our use of the number 12 to divide days and year stems from the Sumerian base 60 numerical system. The zodiac, so central to both ancient and modern astrology, has roots in the celestial observations of Sumerian priests, who first mapped the movements of stars and planets with mathematical care. Culturally, Sumer gave the world its first schools, its first libraries, its first recorded stories and laws. The concept of organized education, the preservation of literature, the idea that wisdom could and should be passed down in written form find their origin in the Edubba, the tablet house, where Sumerian children once sat cross-legged and copied lines in wet clay. The legacy of Sumer also endured in ways more subtle. The tone of their literature, their pursuit of wisdom through paradox and dialogue, their understanding of the divine as both nurturing and dangerous, these traits shaped not just the content of Near Eastern culture, but its soul. They left behind not just inventions, but questions. What is justice? What happens after death? What is the meaning of life and kingship? These questions passed from Sumer to the world beyond, growing and evolving with every new hand that took up the stylus. And so, even as the names of Sumer cities became buried and their walls fell into ruin, the seeds they planted took root elsewhere. Their memory, fragile and fireborn, survived in tablets and tradition. Their influence stretched not through conquest, but through culture. And now, in the quiet work of scholars and the pages of history books, Sumer's voice once more finds its breath. What began in the land between the rivers did not end there. It traveled, it transformed, and through each new civilization that rose, a part of Sumer rose with it, patient, enduring, and eternal. For all that we know of the Sumerians, their cities, laws, gods, and poetry there remains so much we do not. Their world, though partially recovered in broken tablets and temple ruins, still holds deep silences, vast shadows where knowledge once lived. Each discovery opens a window, but beyond each window lies another room, sealed by time. The Sumerians are remembered, yet also remain partially lost, a civilization speaking to us in fragments, hinting at truths not yet revealed. Among the greatest mysteries is the full extent of their origins. Where did the Sumerians come from? Their language is not related to any known family. It stands alone, like an island in the linguistic sea. This isolation has led to endless speculation. Were they native to southern Mesopotamia? Did they migrate from somewhere else long before written history began? The archaeological record grows thinner the farther back we look, until it dissolves into the unmarked past. Their earliest cities, such as Eridu and Uruk, seem to appear fully formed, complete with temples, administrative systems, and complex social structures. How did they reach such levels of organization so early? Was there a forgotten precursor culture that shaped them, now erased by flood, fire, or the relentless passage of time? Or did their civilization emerge from scattered, simpler settlements that rapidly coalesced under shared belief and need? Equally mysterious are the layers of myth that touch on events now hidden from view. The Sumerian king list refers to a time before the flood, when kingship descended from heaven and cities ruled for thousands of years. Were these enormous reigns symbolic, mythical expressions of divine rule? Or do they preserve distant echoes of an older cultural memory in actual prehistoric time, transformed into legend? The flood itself, recorded in multiple Sumerian myths, also remains a question. Was it a metaphor for renewal, or a memory of a real event? Geological and archaeological evidence points to significant flooding in Mesopotamia in ancient times, possibly a regional catastrophe that shaped the minds and stories of generations. But the full scale and cause of this flood remain elusive, its traces swallowed by sediment and obscured by centuries. Many of their texts also remain untranslated. Thousands of tablets, uncovered from cities like Nippur, Uruk, and Umma, still sit in museums and archives, waiting. Some are damaged. Others are inscribed in difficult or archaic forms. Among them may be unknown myths, forgotten laws, letters from merchants, lost hymns to unnamed gods. In the quiet of these clay fragments, entire pieces of the Sumerian worldview may yet sleep. There are also cities mentioned in texts that have never been found. Places like Bad Tibira and Larak, sacred in myth and memory, remain unexcavated or unidentified. Were they destroyed utterly, leaving no trace? Or do they lie beneath modern towns, their secrets unreachable under layers of stone and street? Each time a new site is uncovered, the possibility lingers that we might stumble upon one of these missing hearts of Sumer. And what of the people themselves, their faces, their gestures, their voices? Statues and carvings give us stylized images, but the true emotions, the subtleties of expression, the sound of their language, as it was spoken, are gone. We read their texts, but we do not know how they laughed, how they sang, how their voices rose in prayer or softened in lullabies. These are the human details that history rarely preserves. Even their beliefs, as detailed as they are in hymns and myths, still shimmer with ambiguity. What did they truly feel when they whispered a prayer in the dark? How did they interpret a dream that lingered after waking? What unrecorded rituals did they perform? What private devotions were shared only between parent and child, husband and wife? These inner worlds remain closed to us, hidden not by time, but by their very intimacy. And perhaps that is part of what makes the Sumerians so endlessly compelling. They are known, but not fully, close, but just beyond reach. Each discovery deepens the mystery. Each tablet answered brings another question. We glimpse their world through a keyhole, and just when we think we understand it, the keyhole shifts. Their greatest secret may be this, that no civilization is ever fully lost, nor ever fully found. The Sumerians endure not because we have uncovered all their truths, but because we continue to seek them. Their story is not just history, it is an invitation to look deeper, to listen closer, to remember that the past still stirs beneath the earth, waiting to speak again. When we look at the Sumerians, we often focus on their achievements: writing, law, urban planning, literature. But beneath these accomplishments lies something deeper, a transformation in the way humans understood themselves and the world around them. The true genius of Sumer may not be what they built or wrote, but how they thought. Their civilization represents a turning point in the human story, a moment when imagination, structure, and belief converge to shape the very foundations of the modern mind. One of their most revolutionary contributions was the ability to abstract. In creating writing, the Sumerians moved beyond spoken language into a space where words could be preserved, analyzed, and transmitted independent of voice or presence. They separated sound from meaning, turning breath into symbol. In doing so, they laid the groundwork for literacy, for formal thought, for philosophy and science. Their cuneiform script allowed them not just to record, but to reflect. They documented transactions, but also ideas, relationships, emotions, and dreams. They wrote not only to remember, but to understand. Myths were not only stories, they were meditations on human purpose, divine power, and the patterns of fate. Laws were not just commands, they were expressions of values, attempts to define justice in a changing and complex world. They also introduced the idea of systemic knowledge. Their calendars were precise and cyclical, tied to the moon and the seasons. Their mathematical tables show an ability to generalize patterns, calculate beyond the immediate, and conceptualize quantities in symbolic terms. They used geometry to divide land, predict floods, and build ziggurats that aligned with celestial events. This was more than survival, it was the beginning of theory. Their temples were not just places of worship, but centers of administration, economics, and intellectual activity. Priests were also mathematicians and astronomers. Scribes were historians and poets. In Sumer, knowledge was not divided, it flowed in a single stream, where sacred and practical were one. The idea that a society should collect, organize, and transmit knowledge systematically was born here. The seed of the library, the academy, the university planted in clay. The Sumerians even understood the power of narrative. In their epics, they explored ambition, mortality, love, fear, and failure. Gilgamesh, their greatest literary hero, is not a god untouched by doubt, but a man torn between strength and sorrow, desperately seeking meaning in a world where even kings must die. This humanization of the heroic figure marked a radical shift tone that would echo in every great literature to follow. And through it all, they valued memory. In a world without mass production, they used clay to make thoughts durable. In a world without printing presses, they trained scribes to preserve, to copy, to continue. Their concern for legacy was not just political or religious, it was existential. They understood that civilization is not just built with stone, but with story, that knowledge, passed carefully from hand to hand, is the true architecture of eternity. Their spirit of innovation was not restless, it was reverent. They didn't seek novelty for its own sake. Each new system, each reform, each work of art was rooted in the desire to align with the divine, to reflect a cosmic order they believed was both real and accessible. Creativity was not rebellion, it was resonance with something greater. And perhaps that's why their innovations lasted. Because they weren't imposed from above, they grew from the ground up, from the fields, the markets, the homes, the prayers of ordinary people. The Sumerians didn't separate intellect from life. They saw thinking, working, and worshipping as part of one continuum. In this, they shaped not only their world but ours. Every written contract, every planned city, every system of measurement, every myth retold bears a shadow of their original vision. Their insights were not just technical, but philosophical. They taught us that we could shape our surroundings and in doing so, shape ourselves. So while their cities may lie in ruins and their language no longer rises in the streets, the way they looked at the world continues. The Sumerians gave us more than artifacts. They gave us a lens, a way to see not just what is, but what could be, a whisper of innovation that still stirs in the back of the human mind. Clay, soft, malleable, humble, and yet, for the Sumerians, it was the medium through which memory was made immortal. There is something profound in their choice of material, earth and water, shaped by hand, then left to dry in the sun or hardened in fire. From this ordinary substance, they captured the extraordinary. They pressed into it their stories, their contracts, their prayers and their fears. And in doing so, they preserved not only knowledge, but humanity itself. Every cuneiform tablet is a small act of defiance against time, fragile, easily shattered, yet somehow enduring beyond empires, beyond languages, beyond the hands that shaped them. Each bears the weight of its moment, sometimes mundane, sometimes magnificent. A receipt for barley, a hymn to Inanna, a king's boast, a child's practice exercise. All equally valid, all equally precious. It's easy to think of ancient civilizations in terms of their greatness, their conquests, their inventions, their monuments. But what the Sumerians left behind in clay is something more intimate. They left a trace of thought, a map of emotion. In their laments, we hear grief. In their love poems, longing. In their laws, concern for justice. In their rituals, the need for connection. Across 4,000 years, their inner world still touches ours. And through clay, they wrestled with mortality. Again and again, their stories return to death, not with morbid fascination, but with quiet acceptance. In the epic of Gilgamesh, the great king weeps for his lost friend, then journeys to the ends of the earth seeking immortality, only to return home, changed not by what he gains, but by what he understands. That life is precious not because it lasts forever, but because it does not. The Sumerians knew this deeply. Their funerary practices, their rituals for the dead, their songs of lament, all speak of a people trying to give shape to grief, trying to name what can't be stopped, and in naming it, to find peace. Their concept of the afterlife, the land of dust, was not glorious, but real. Yet they honored it. They prepared for it. They remembered the dead, so they wouldn't disappear completely. In this, there is a kind of honesty. The Sumerians didn't build pyramids or seek eternal flesh. They sought eternal memory, through stories, through clay, through song. They understood that remembrance is a kind of resurrection, that when someone's name is spoken, they live again, if only for a moment. And so, with every tablet unearthed, every inscription translated, every hymn read aloud in a modern voice, we take part in that resurrection. We become part of their story, not as conquerors or archaeologists, but as witnesses, as listeners, as the next link in the long chain of remembering. They did not ask to be eternal. They simply wanted not to be forgotten. And now, they are not. Their story, pressed into the soft earth beneath ancient fingers, has traveled across time. It has survived flood, fire, war, and neglect. It has crossed oceans, been pieced together from fragments, and spoken again in languages they never knew. In the end, the Sumerians remind us that civilization is not just what we build, it's what we preserve. It's not just stone and power, it's song and thought. The weight of clay in their hands was the weight of everything they hoped would last. And it did. In the southern reaches of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers wind through plains of sun-baked soil, something extraordinary once unfolded. It began quietly, clusters of homes, scattered farms, flickers of belief, and grew into one of humanity's most remarkable creations. Sumer, the first civilization. Not just a collection of cities, but a vision of what it means to be human, to build, to record, to question, to remember. As we reach the end of this long journey through their world, we do not stand at a finish line but at a beginning. For the Sumerians, though ancient and distant, are not truly gone. Their thoughts are etched into the frameworks of modern life. Their symbols, reworked again and again, still whisper in law books, libraries, lunar calendars, and the language of logic and order. From the first brick of Eridu to the grand ziggurat of Ur, from the hand that pressed wet clay to the priest who tracked the moon, the Sumerians revealed a new way of existing. They gave shape to abstract things: law, time, kingship, writing, and wrapped the unseen in ritual and meaning. They turned rivers into roads, fields into cities, and sound into sign. They organized society not by instinct alone, but by choice, by structure, by shared belief. Their legacy is not heroic in the mythic sense. They did not conquer the world. They did not escape death. They rose and they fell, like all who have come and will come. But in their rising, they gave us something permanent: the foundation. They were the first to ask, "What lasts?" And they answered not with stone or sword, but with story. And the stories endure. Gilgamesh still walks beside you, ambitious, flawed, and searching. Enheduanna still sings, her voice trembling across centuries. The laments of Ur still echo with sorrow and beauty. Their gods may be renamed or forgotten, their cities buried beneath dust and asphalt. But their questions about justice, purpose, love, death are still ours. The cradle of civilization was not just a place, it was a moment, a recognition, a light. And now, that light shines through us. We write because they wrote. We plan because they measured. We dream because they dreamed. Every time we organize, record, design, or wonder at the stars, we continue what they began. They left no final word, no single monument to say, "This is who we were." Instead, they scattered their truth across 1,000,000 fragments, tablets, walls, prayers, names, and like a great mosaic, those pieces are still being gathered, still being read, still being heard. And so, in the end, the story of the Sumerians is not one of ruins, but of roots, deep, unseen, but supporting everything that came after. This was their gift. This is their immortality. And now, it is ours to carry forward. And so, the story of the Sumerians draws to a close. Their cities may be gone, their temples silent, but their voices still echo in the things we build, in the words we write, in the way we wonder about the stars and the meaning of it all. They were the first to ask who we are, and in many ways, they gave us our first answers. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, through clay, through memory. Sleep well, and let the echoes of ancient wisdom carry you into peaceful dreams. Good night.